Hi everyone. If you're new, welcome aboard. If you're a regular, welcome back. Where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Let me know in the comments. Now relax and enjoy the stories. In June of 1969, 6-year-old Dennis Martin joined his family on a camping trip to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, located along the Tennessee-North Carolina border in the southeastern U.S. The park's name comes from the natural fog that frequently drifts over the mountains, creating the illusion of smoke rising from a distance. Interestingly, this fog is actually caused by chemicals released from the local plants, which have a high vapor pressure and easily form vapors under normal temperature and pressure. While the scientific explanation behind this phenomenon is well understood, witnessing the thick fog clinging to the mountaintops is still an eerie experience. The Martin family, from nearby Knoxville, Tennessee, had a long tradition of celebrating Father's Day with camping trips to the Smoky Mountains. 1969 marked Dennis's first trip into the woods with his father, older brother, and grandfather. The family drove to Cades Cove, a remote valley in the Tennessee section of the park, where they hiked toward Russell Field to set up camp and prepare for their first night in the wilderness. The next morning, they set off for Spence Field, a beautiful highland meadow and popular camping site, crisscrossed by the Appalachian Trail's rolling hills and rugged peaks. Once at Spence Field, Dennis and his older brothers ventured off to explore the campsite, striking up conversations with other campers' children and quickly making friends with the group of kids there. Dennis's father was happy to see his son fitting in so well with the other children. With the kids occupied, the adults got to work setting up their 4-person tent. By the time the tent was ready, Dennis was still playing with the new friends he'd made. His father recalls watching the kids excitedly take up hiding spots to ambush a group of approaching adults. When the adults entered the kids' kill zone, the children jumped out, growling and roaring like wild animals as they playfully attacked their laughing parents. All but one, all but little Dennis. His father watched with growing concern as the seconds ticked by, and Dennis had yet to emerge from his hiding spot. Eventually, he couldn't bear it anymore, and after rising from his camping chair, Dennis's father marched off the spot where he had last seen a 6-year-old son and began calling out his name. But what started out as stern fatherly commands soon degenerated into terrified pleas. And as it continued to call out in desperation, the other families began to realize that something was terribly wrong. Once Dennis's grandpa knew he was missing, he set the group into action, sending one group 2 miles up the Appalachian Trail with his son, while he led another group back towards the Cades Cove Ranger Station, arriving there around 8:30 p.m. that night. Thus began an extensive, well-publicized search and rescue operation in which National Park Service personnel was supplemented by National Guard soldiers and even the units of Green Berets. At the peak of the search operation, more than 1,400 people were operating in the few square miles around Spence Field, but not a single one found anything that could lead them to the missing boy. However, in the aftermath of the operation, the search efforts drew a great deal of criticism from search and rescue experts far and wide, who said the large number of personnel involved potentially obscuring tracks and ground that was already difficult to track over due to heavy rain. Shockingly, a shoe print belonging to that of a child was actually found at one point, but the track was dismissed as belonging to one of the Boy Scouts that was helping with the search. Later, however, investigators kicked themselves when they found that the tracks were determined to have come from a child who was missing one shoe, which disappeared on the banks of a stream. Some suggesting it was possible that the tracks belonged to Martin, and this theory was supported when a discarded child-sized shoe and sock were found just 3 days later. Although search and rescue personnel continue their search for more than 2 weeks, scouring the hillsides night and day and continual shifts, no further clues to Martin's whereabouts were ever found. The Martin family was so understandably desperate for answers that they offered a $5,000 reward for any information that would reunite them with their beloved Dennis. This got the attention of the handful of so-called psychics, who some might argue sought to exploit the Martin family's grief, and maybe cashing in if they guessed the right area of the Smokies to search. Surprisingly, none of these psychics ever proved to be of any help. Many years later, in 1985, a man who had apparently been illegally collecting American gins sing in the park claimed to have come across the skeletal remains of a child while exploring the woods. The man said he should have reported the find, but was terrified of being prosecuted for his prohibited herbal hobby. Not only that, but he was also unable to point investigators in the direction of the site he'd found the bones in the first place. There have been many theories that have attempted to explain what happened to young Dennis Martin that day. Most detectives, both amateur and professional, believe that Dennis became disoriented whilst looking for a hiding place, maybe even forgetting his way back to camp when he emerged from it. Either way, Dennis then strayed further from the camp and could easily have fallen down one of the many steep slopes and ravines that dotted the area surrounding Spence Field. However, Dennis was wearing a bright red t-shirt when he went missing, not something that would be easy for search and rescue teams to miss. Dennis would have to be completely covered in foliage to remain undetected with that color of shirt. And despite it being feasible due to a small size, the likelihood of that is extremely low. Others are quick to remind us of the presence of black bears in the area, as well as copperhead vipers and feral pigs, all of which would have posed a considerable threat to 6-year-old Martin. Park rangers told investigating police that an underweight bear had been caught in a boar trap in the Spence Field area just 2 weeks earlier. Although the bear was released safely, the incident suggested that it may have been struggling to find enough food, prompting to turn to a less familiar source of food. Yet, however tragic and brutal the aforementioned theories are, Dennis's father believes something considerably more sinister. Based on the eyewitness account of one Harold Key, who says he heard a loud scream on the very same afternoon that Dennis disappeared, Dennis's dad firmly believed that his son was kidnapped by an opportunistic predator. Shortly after he heard the scream, Harold Key claimed to have seen a disheveled bearded man with wild, unkempt hair fleeing through the woods in an apparent bid to remain undetected by the nearby campers. Harold's family went on to explain that they saw a flash of red on the figure's shoulders, which some believe was actually Dennis himself slung over the shoulder of this mysterious figure as they carried him away. Harold later speculated that the man may have been a moonshiner, explaining his reluctance to be seen. Despite the report, FBI investigators ultimately dismissed it, saying that as much as Harold meant well, his account was frankly unreliable as his timeline of events were off. But one retired park ranger lamented the failure to properly follow up either the footprints or the sighting of the rough-looking man, arguing that as the location the sighting was downhill from where Dennis disappeared, it was possible to cover that distance in the time frame even carrying a child, but that the individual in question would have some impressive strength, stealth, and endurance. So if this is the case, who is this hairy mystery man? This bearded vagrant who was apparently capable of such an impressive physical feat, even if it was in the context of the despicable abduction of a child. Given the lack of investigation into his sighting or his tracks, it seems we might never know. But even if we did get to the bottom of the mystery of a man living in the Appalachian Mountains with a penchant for kidnapping children, I don't think the answers would bring us any solace. Maybe the closure would be worth it, especially for the family, but nightmares can be a high price to pay. And wondering what happened to young Dennis Martin can give even the most hardened true crime reader some very sleepless nights. I take a lot of short camping trips throughout the year, usually keeping them under 3 days so I can fit them into weekends without having to take too much time off from work. This particular weekend in April, I had planned to hike about 5 hours to a small, remote lake and camp there for a couple of nights before heading back. The lake didn't have any established trails, which was one of the reasons I chose it. It meant I wouldn't have to share the spot with a bunch of other campers. Getting lost wasn't a big concern either, since it was only a 5-hour hike. About 4 hours into the hike, I thought I saw someone. I wasn't paying full attention when I saw something rush past in the distance. I froze, trying to figure out what it was, but there was no further movement. I wasn't looking directly at it, so I couldn't say for sure it was a person, but it definitely caught my attention. I kept my eyes peeled for the rest of the hike, and when I reached the lake, its beauty was breathtaking. It was a perfect spot to relax. I didn't take long to find a campsite, setting up just off the lake, surrounded by trees. Not long after I set up, I saw someone again. This time, there was no mistaking it. They were on the other side of the lake, walking around the trees. They didn't have a backpack or anything with them, just walking. I looked around for a campsite, but didn't see anything. After a minute, they disappeared into the forest and didn't come back. This left me feeling a bit uneasy, wondering if I had really seen someone earlier during the hike. I decided to stay at the campsite and, as night fell, I started a fire. I kept it small so it wouldn't attract too much attention. It had been about 4 hours since I saw the person, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I ate, then took out a book to pass the time, but I couldn't focus. Every time I looked around, I had this feeling like I was being watched. I knew it was probably just my brain playing tricks on me, but it was enough to make me put the book down and pack everything up in my tent, preparing to go to sleep. Just before I put out the fire, I looked around one last time. About 15 yards away, I saw someone standing still in the darkness. I could tell they were watching me. We just stared at each other for what felt like a full minute before they slowly began backing up, still facing me, and disappeared into the trees. I was shaking with fear. What were they doing? Would they come back? I made the fire larger and stayed awake all night, watching the darkness. At dawn, I packed up as quickly as I could and left. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. On my hike back, I swear I heard footsteps behind me a few times. Even now, thinking back to that trip, I can feel my body tense up from the fear. I don't know who that person was or what they were doing, but based on how they were watching me, it couldn't have been anything good. I'm sure if I'd stayed another night or gone to sleep in the tent, I wouldn't be here today. The beam of my flashlight flickered, casting unsettling shadows across the cave walls. I gave it a few taps against my palm, hoping it would stabilize, but the light only seemed to fade further. In the deep, suffocating darkness of the cavern, that failing light was our only source of hope, and it was slipping away. "Guys," I called out, my voice echoing through the damp stone. "We've got a problem." This was supposed to be a simple expedition. Sarah, Mike, and I had been planning this caving trip for months. We were seasoned hikers, but this was our first time exploring a cave system of this size. The excitement of the adventure had made us push aside any worries. But now, as the pitch-black surroundings closed in on us, I realized just how naive we'd been. We had entered the cave early that morning, confident with our maps, ropes, and what we thought were more than enough supplies. The first few hours had been thrilling. We marveled at the stunning rock formations, snapped pictures of the underground streams, and enjoyed the feeling of being the first to witness these secret wonders. But as we ventured further into the cave, things began to unravel. We missed a turn, ending up in an unfamiliar part of the cave that didn't match our maps. After retracing our steps, we discovered that every tunnel looked the same. Then, Mike slipped on a slippery rock and twisted his ankle. It wasn't too bad, but it definitely slowed us down. And now our main flashlight was failing. "What do you mean, a problem?" Sarah's voice called out from somewhere on my left, trembling with barely contained fear. I aimed the flickering light toward her, catching the reflection of her wide eyes. "The flashlight's dying," I said. "I think the batteries are going," I added. Mike hobbled over, his face ashen in the weak light. "That's impossible. We packed fresh batteries this morning." "Well, apparently not fresh enough," I snapped, immediately regretting the harshness of my words. This wasn't anyone's fault. We were all in this together. Sarah pulled out her phone, the faint light from the screen casting an eerie glow over her face. "No signal," she said, "but we can use the flashlight here for a while." I nodded, grateful for her quick thinking. "Good idea, but let's conserve it as much as we can. We don't know how long we'll be down here." The reality of our situation was starting to sink in. We were lost in a maze of underground tunnels with limited light and no way to call for help. The cool, damp air that had felt refreshing hours ago now seemed to cling to my skin, chilling me to the bone. "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need a plan. We can't just wander around aimlessly. That'll only get us more lost." Mike nodded, wincing as he put weight on his injured ankle. "We should try to retrace our steps, find our way back to the main tunnel." It was a good idea in theory, but as we started to move, it became clear how difficult it would be in practice. Every tunnel looked the same in the dim light of Sarah's phone. We turned down a path thinking it was familiar, only to end up in a dead end or a chamber we'd never seen before. Hours passed, though it was impossible to tell exactly how many in the timeless dark of the cave. We rationed our food and water, knowing we might need to make it last. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of our footsteps and the occasional drip of water from the cave ceiling. As we pushed on, the strain started to show. Mike's limp got worse, and Sarah's hands shook as she held the phone, its battery slowly but steadily draining. I felt a creeping claustrophobia, the weight of the earth above us seeming to press down harder with each passing minute. Then we heard it, a sound so faint at first that I thought I was imagining it. A low rumble, more felt than heard, reverberating through the rock around us. "Did you guys feel that?" I whispered, not sure why I was keeping my voice down. Sarah nodded, her eyes wide. "What was it? An earthquake?" Before anyone could answer, the rumble came again, louder this time. Small pebbles skittered across the cave floor, and a fine dust rained down from above. "We need to move," Mike said urgently. Now, we stumbled forward, no longer caring about trying to find our way out. Our only goal now was to find somewhere that seemed stable, somewhere we might be safe if the cave decided to come down around us. The rumbling continued, growing in intensity. Larger rocks began to fall, forcing us to dodge and weave as we ran. Sarah's phone flashlight bounced wildly, creating a strobe-like effect that made the whole scene feel like a nightmare. Just when I thought we couldn't go on any longer, we burst into a large chamber. The ceiling arched high above us, supported by massive columns of rock. It felt more stable than the narrow tunnels we'd been in, and without discussing it, we all headed for the center of the room. We huddled together as the cave shook around us. I could feel Sarah trembling beside me, heard Mike's ragged breathing. In that moment, faced with the very real possibility that we might die here, I felt a surge of affection for my friends. Whatever happened, at least we were together. The quake seemed to last an eternity, but it was probably only a few minutes. When it finally subsided, we were left in a thick, choking silence. Sarah's phone had gone dark. Whether from damage or a drained battery, I couldn't tell. We were plunged into absolute darkness. I've heard people say they couldn't see their hand in front of their face, but I'd always thought it was an exaggeration. Now I understood. The darkness was complete, absolute. It pressed against my eyeballs, seeming to seep into my very being. Is everyone okay?" I managed to croak out, my throat dry from the dust. "I think so," Sarah replied, her voice small and scared. Mike grunted in affirmation, and I felt him shift beside me. We sat in silence for a long while, each lost in our own thoughts. The reality of our situation was impossible to ignore now. We were trapped, possibly buried alive, with no light and no way to call for help. Our chances of rescue, of survival, seemed vanishingly small. But giving up wasn't an option. We were still alive, still breathing. As long as that was true, we had to keep trying. "Okay," I said, breaking the silence. "We need to think. There has to be a way out of here." "How?" Sarah's voice cracked. "We don't even know where here is anymore." "No, but we know caves often have multiple entrances." Mike chimed in. "And air has to be getting in from somewhere or we'd have suffocated by now." He was right. I took a deep breath, trying to focus. "All right, let's try to feel for any air currents. They might lead us to an exit." We spread out, crawling across the rocky ground, our hands brushing over the uneven surface. It was slow, exhausting work. Every few minutes, we called out to each other, using our voices to stay connected in the thick, oppressive darkness. I couldn't say how long we searched. Time felt irrelevant in the endless black. But eventually, I felt it, the faintest hint of a breeze against my cheek. "Guys!" I called, my voice trembling with excitement. "I think I found something." Sarah and Mike quickly made their way over. Together, we followed the gentle breeze, our hands skimming the cave wall. The air grew stronger, and with it came a smell, a fresh, earthy scent that reminded me of the outdoors. the outside world. Our pace quickened, fueled by the hope of escape. The tunnel began to narrow, forcing us to crawl on our stomachs. But we kept moving, the thought of freedom pushing us forward. And then there it was, a tiny glimmer of light in the distance. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. But as we drew closer, it grew brighter. Sunlight. It was shining through a small crack in the rock. The opening was tiny, just large enough for a person to squeeze through, but it was our way out. With everything we had, we clawed at the rock, slowly enlarging the gap. Our hands were cut and scraped, but we barely felt it. Finally, the hole was big enough. One by one, we squeezed through. We emerged into the glaring sunlight of late afternoon. We were on the side of the mountain, far from where we had entered the cave system, but we were out. We were alive, lying on the grass, breathing in the fresh air. The warmth of the sun on our skin. I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. For life, for friendship, and for the simple joy of light. Our ordeal had lasted less than 2 days, but it had changed us forever. We had gained a new respect for the forces of nature and for our own resilience. But most of all, we learned never to take light for granted again. I want to start by saying that, for the sake of confidentiality, all real names will be replaced with fake ones. When my friends and I were around 18, we went through a phase where we were fascinated by the idea of exploring abandoned locations, often ignoring how dangerous or risky some of these places could be. Since I lived in one of the more suburban, lesser-known areas of Australia, it was usually hard to find new spots to investigate. So, when we heard about an abandoned apartment complex in the city, we jumped at the chance to check it out. We decided to go on the same night we were planning to visit a club, so by the time we arrived, most of us were either buzzed or pretty intoxicated. Looking back, it was a dumb idea, but we were young and naive. Now, let me introduce my friends. There's Don, a well-built guy who usually led most of our expeditions. Then there's Connor, who, like me, loved exploring and usually followed Don's lead. We also had Beth, Kate, Jill, and Brooke, who mostly came for the club but decided to tag along for the adventure. When we got to the apartment complex, we were met with a large fence surrounding the entire perimeter. At that point, Kate volunteered to be the lookout for security from the outside, since the place still seemed somewhat monitored. After some effort, the rest of us managed to climb over the fence and found ourselves in front of a large U-shaped building, standing around 20 stories tall. As usual, Don took the lead and boldly opened the door to one of the stairwells, with Connor and me eagerly following him, and the girls trailing behind us, hesitantly but still curious. We spent most of our time opening doors and peering into rooms. It wasn't unusual to find old plates and other objects left behind by previous occupants, scattered on the stained, rugged floors or broken kitchen counters. As we moved further into the complex, we noticed that the stairways were oddly blocked off, so we had to keep switching between stairwells to reach higher floors. By the time we reached the 15th floor, I started getting bored, as all the rooms seemed eerily similar. In my somewhat drunken state, I thought it would be a great idea to randomly try to kick in one of the sliding glass doors. I know it was a dumb idea, but when you're in that mindset, you don't really think about the consequences. Of course, my attempt was weak and unsuccessful, and the others scolded me for the noise I made. While we were laughing it off, I noticed Jill's face go pale. She began shushing us and pointing upwards. "Did any of you hear that? I think there's someone above us," she quietly exclaimed. That was enough to send Beth and Brooke into a panic, and they wanted to leave immediately. Don, however, had a different idea. "Then let's go, hurry," he said while brushing past us to the door. Don has always been like this, disregarding safety before exploration. We didn't even have time to say no. However, we all had to follow him as we all didn't want him to possibly get hurt or for us 5 to be left alone without Don to guide us. Reluctantly, we all quietly chased after Don, who by this point began peeking through the doors and windows to each room on the floor above. We were about halfway through the hallway when we saw security flashlights on the bottom floor, along with Kate's message alerting what we were seeing. "Crap, The sound of the kick must have been too loud, and now the bottom level is on high alert. Simultaneously as this is happening, we hear a large thud in one of the rooms right next to where we are standing. Don froze. I guess he must have initially thought that Jill was joking and tried to play it off as such to freak out the rest of us. Yet, I had never seen him so reluctant on an exploration before. We all heard it this time. As we approached the door, we continued to hear slight shuffling from the room. This was enough to send Jill, Beth, and Brooke to the other end of the walkway, begging us to leave. But myself, Don, and Connor all knew that, for the sake of conclusions, we all needed to see what was behind that door. Don began to approach the door, turned the knob, and pushed the door wide open. I then used my phone to illuminate the room. What we saw next is permanently ingrained in my mind. We saw an older-looking man, gray beard with minimal hair, cuts all along his right arm, holding a reflective object resembling a shard of glass or a knife, with the most crooked and twisted smile on his face. The crimson-red liquid was splattered all over the carpet, and next thing I know, Don and Connor have already began fleeing the scene. I too followed closely after them. It was hard to tell if he was chasing us, but assuming the worst, we nearly fell down the flight of stairs, desperately trying to get away. Once exiting through the first floor, we were quickly detained by the security staff, clearly seeing the distress on each of our faces as we tried to communicate the situation we had just witnessed. Long story short, the cops were called to investigate the building and find the man, and roughly half an hour later they came out with the man in cuffs. He looked filthy and evil as he gave us one last grin before entering the police car. One cop who had been up there told us that it was a good thing we got away from there, as his intentions were very clearly awful. Safe to say that we didn't go to any more clubs that night. The next morning I woke up and checked my phone to be introduced with a flood of messages on our group chat. I scrolled up to the beginning to see that Connor had sent a news article published this morning stating that a homeless man had been murdered and his body was discovered within the apartment complex that night. This sent chills down my spine as I recalled that image of him and the amount of blood pooled on the ground and down his arm, and worst of all, that insane, crooked smile. Since this event 2 years ago, none of us have been exploring abandoned places, and in all honesty, I think it's going to stay that way for a really, really long time. During Thanksgiving weekend in 1950, a brutal nor'easter storm slammed the coast of Massachusetts, particularly impacting the small town of Marblehead, near Salem. Beryl Atherton, a 47-year-old elementary school teacher with 25 years of experience, was home alone with her dog, Esky, a white Spitz that was her only companion. After the death of her father, Esky had become her constant friend, and Atherton, who often described herself as a spinster, had little to no family or friends. She was known for her love of watching old movies and would often drive to a theater in Lynn to catch a show. But she always went by herself. On this particularly cold evening, as freezing winds battered her simple cottage on Sewell Street, Beryl went out to run some last-minute errands before the storm fully set in. She stopped by the grocery store to stock up on essentials, including extra cans of dog food for Esky, before heading outside around 6 p.m. to take the trash to the cans behind her home. While doing so, she noticed a young boy from the neighborhood watching her from his window. She waved, and that was the last time anyone saw her alive. As the storm intensified, Marblehead became completely snowed in, and it wasn't until Monday, November 27th, that the town managed to dig itself out and resume normal activities. The town's milkman, known only as Pint, made his regular rounds to deliver milk. He usually left the milk on doorsteps, but he knew that Miss Atherton, frail and weighing barely 100 pounds, was particularly vulnerable after such a severe storm. Concerned for her well-being, he decided to knock on her door to check on her. He knocked once, but there was no response. He knocked again, still no answer. On a hunch, Pint tried the door handle and found it unlocked. He entered the house cautiously, calling out her name, before slowly making his way to the kitchen. What he found there would haunt him forever. Beryl Atherton was lying on the floor, face up, in a pool of her own blood, with Esky curled beside her, mewling in pain. Pint screamed in horror and rushed out of the house, running to a nearby neighbor's home to call the police. When the authorities arrived, they determined that Beryl had been dead for several days. On the kitchen table, the brown paper grocery bags from her last errand still sat, untouched, filled with the food she had bought that day. It became clear that only moments after waving to the boy, Beryl's life was violently taken, and within an hour, she had been left to die in her own home. She had several broken ribs and bruising around her throat where she appeared to have been strangled. Strangled so hard that there were still fingernail imprints in her cold, dead flesh. Her killer had then used a small blade to slice her throat. Infuriatingly, the crime scene was almost completely devoid of any clue as to the identity of Beryl's murderer. There wasn't a single sign of forced entry anywhere on the property. There were no fingerprints on any surface and no shoe or boot prints on the grounds surrounding the house. And despite questioning Beryl's neighbors, no one but the dog, Esky, had seen the killer in the flesh. If Miss Atherton cried out for help, the severity of the storm would have probably drowned out any urgent pleas on that fateful night. No one in the surrounding neighborhood had heard or seen a thing. Despite the grotesque violence of the scene, there appeared to be few signs of a struggle apart from a broken necklace caused by the impact of the killer's blade, which also had broken during the savage and unprovoked attack. And aside from a few broken fingers that suggested she had tried and failed to defend herself from her attacker, it seemed that he had managed to sneak up on Beryl while she was totally unaware. The crime scene was so lacking in useful evidence that it had been theorized that the killer actually hung around for a little while, ensuring that there were no fingerprints, fibers, or DNA present. And since the murder took place in Beryl's kitchen, the killer may have well had ample access to cleaning supplies in order to ensure the scene was scrubbed of evidence. Both police and friends were surprised by the fact Miss Atherton kept a diary which yielded information about a handful of male acquaintances. The information therein offered no help in solving the crime. It was discovered she had been deeply disappointed over a broken love affair, but this proved not to enter into the case either. In the aftermath of Beryl's murder, with police unable to come up with any suspects or clear motives for her killing, the small town of Marblehead became rife with rumors and gossip. Some said Beryl was leading some kind of double life and had become embroiled with organized crime down in Boston that had come back to bite her. Others believed it was a jilted lover from a broken love affair that had sought revenge after Beryl had broken the engagement off. Or perhaps a relative who learned of a sizable inheritance that either wished to access early or were about to be cut off from. Yet her estate only consisted of about $25,000, and no jewelry or other items appeared to have been stolen from the house. So it seems that financial gain may not have been the motive. But chillingly enough, there are some living in Marblehead today who claim they know full well who killed Beryl and a handful who assert that the killer is still alive. Given that the killer might well be up to 80 or 90 years old, it's more than likely they may pass away before ever facing any charges for the murder they committed. And so, it seems that the brutal crime committed that Thanksgiving weekend may forever remain unsolved, and that yet another cold and callous murderer will escape justice, free to walk the streets in the knowledge that they committed the worst act a person is capable of and got away with it. I have an aunt who lives in a haunted house. The house was built in the late 1800s and has a strange setup. It's technically two identical houses joined together to form one large home. According to my mom, the house was once owned by twin sisters who lived on separate sides, with a staircase in the attic connecting their two homes. The legend goes that the twins had an uncle who did unspeakable things to them, and it led to one of the sisters becoming pregnant and having a baby. The other twin then smothered the baby, and both sisters ultimately took their own lives. Strangely, almost every family member who spent the night at that house has left with a strange story to tell. Unfortunately, I'm no exception. I've had two different experiences of my own. The summer after I graduated 8th grade, my older cousin was getting married out of state. Since not everyone from our state could go, my aunt and I went by ourselves. We had an extremely early flight, so my aunt thought it would be best for me to spend the night at her house before we left. I asked if I could sleep in her room. She asked why, and I just told her, because the house is haunted. As usual, she shrugged it off, angrily claiming there were no ghosts. She said, "If it'll make you feel better, you can sleep in my room." As night approached, I went to the bathroom and took some sleep medicine, hoping it would knock me out before my aunt fell asleep. Unfortunately, it didn't. My aunt fell asleep, and I lay there, wide awake and terrified, occasionally glancing from the TV to the open door, peering down the hallway. A couple of hours passed, and nothing happened. I began to relax a bit and feel more comfortable in the bed. But suddenly, the closet door knob started spinning rapidly, as if someone was trying to get out. I shot up in bed, fully awake and in panic mode. The rest of the night, I stayed up, staring at the closet door, too scared to look away. I still have no idea what was trying to open the closet, but I'm thankful nothing ever did. Fast forward to the summer after I graduated college, and I spent the night at her house again. Like the last time, we were traveling out of town the next day, and my aunt thought it would be best if I stayed at her house so we could catch our early flight. Reluctantly, I agreed. As we settled down for the night, I headed to the room where I was supposed to sleep. Again, quote unquote. It was the room down the hall from my aunt's. I closed the door, put on my pajamas, and sat down on the recliner in front of the TV. I had already mentally prepared myself and had expected to stay awake the entire night. The beginning of the night, I browsed the web on my phone to pass time. A couple of hours passed and nothing happened. As soon as the clock approached 3 a.m., I began to hear what sounded like heeled shoes walking. Whatever it was walked up the stairs, down the hall, and stopped right outside the room I was in. I immediately jumped up, went to the heavy day bed in the room, and pushed it in front of the door to prevent whatever it was from opening the door. The walking continued again and again. It would start from the base of the stairs, go up the stairs and down the hall, each time stopping right outside the door of the room I was in. Despite barricading the door closed, I was still scared. To lighten up the tense atmosphere, I turned on a channel that had stand-up comedy and tried to watch that. But I was still scared. The walking persisted for the entire hour. Eventually it stopped, but I kept the door barricaded, remained awake, and waited until morning to open the door. Needless to say, I have not been back to sleep over at my aunt's house and never will again. This happened during my junior year of high school. One evening, my mom and stepdad went out to some event. Maybe it was a long dinner or a concert, I can't remember. I stayed home to finish a paper that was due the next day, spending the entire night working at the desk in my room. To give you an idea of the setup, my desk faced a wall, and next to it was a small window on the same wall. From where I sat, my back was turned to the doorway. I was wearing my new noise-canceling headphones, a birthday gift. My parents left around 6 p.m., and for the rest of the evening, I stayed at my desk, blasting music through my headphones while working on my essay. Every once in a while, I'd take a break to watch the rain and lightning outside. I never left my desk. My parents came back around 11 p.m., and at some point that night, I had taken my headphones off. Just minutes after I took them off, I clearly heard the garage door open and then the door to the house. Seconds after they came inside, I heard my mom shout my name. "Adrienne!" she screamed. "What on earth happened in here?" I was confused, so I stood up and walked through the house to see what was going on. My room was just down a small hallway from the living room. In my rush to find out why my mom was shouting, I didn't pay much attention to the hallway or the house in general. A few moments later, I reached them. My mom looked incredibly upset. "Was this you? Did you have friends over?" I looked down and froze. The carpet was ruined, covered in muddy footprints. I quickly explained that I had no idea how they got there. I'd been at my desk all night, working on my paper. I watched as her expression shifted from anger to confusion, then to fear. It dawned on us that someone else must have come into the house. We quickly scanned the footprints, trying to make sense of it all. It didn't take long for us to figure out where they started. Our back door, which we usually left unlocked. But then we noticed something else. The footprints started at the back door, but there were no footprints leading back out. Suddenly, we heard pounding noises coming from inside the house. The front door was ripped open and slammed shut. We all bolted for the garage and locked the door behind us. My mom starts shouting at the police through the phone, "Please come quickly. Someone has broken into our house." After what seems like hours, the police arrive. An officer stays with us in the garage as his partner goes through the house room by room. His partner tells us that it's safe to go back in, that there's no one in the house. Then, she asks us a question. She asks us whose room is down the hall to the left. My parents look at me, and I tell the officer that it's mine. She asks us to follow her down the hall. As we go, it's easy to see that the footprints weave through my house from the back door. They go through the living room, through the small hallway into my parents' room, which is down the hall to the right, and then turn around towards my room, and then stop in my doorway. Then the officer points at my door, which I had left open the whole night. On it, in black Sharpie, was written the following: 8:47, I see you. 8:53, you forgot to lock the back door. 8:59, you seem focused. 9:24, turn around. 9:47, look at me. 1015, look at me. 10:37, look at me. 10:49, look at me. For nearly 2 hours, someone stood in my doorway watching me. To this day, I shudder to think about what would have happened if I had ever turned around and looked at them. They say eavesdroppers never hear anything good about themselves. But what I overheard that night in the Hungarian countryside wasn't about me. It was something much darker. Something that transformed what should have been a peaceful camping trip into a frantic struggle for survival. I had always been drawn to the idea of stealth camping. There's a certain excitement in setting up camp in a remote place, far away from established campgrounds and prying eyes. When I planned my backpacking trip through Europe, I intentionally sought out some off-the-beaten-path adventures. Hungary wasn't originally on my radar, but a fellow traveler I met in Vienna went on and on about the stunning countryside, urging me to check it out. "There's this perfect spot," he said, pointing to a place on my map. "Completely secluded, amazing views. You'll love it." I should have been more cautious, but the allure of solitude and untouched nature was irresistible. So, I found myself on a local bus, traveling deep into the Hungarian countryside, my backpack loaded with camping gear and a few days' worth of food. The bus dropped me off in a small village that felt like it had been frozen in time. Old women in headscarves watched curiously as I adjusted my backpack and checked my map. I smiled and waved, trying to seem friendly and harmless. I made my way down a dirt road that stretched out from the village, leading into the rolling hills beyond. The hike was beautiful. Fields of golden wheat swayed in the breeze, interrupted only by colorful patches of wildflowers. In the distance, thick forests crowned the hills. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the land, I arrived at the spot my fellow traveler had mentioned. It was exactly what I had hoped for, a small clearing at the edge of the forest, looking out over a valley. I could see for miles, with the countryside glowing under the warm light of the setting sun. I quickly set up my tent and made a simple dinner on my camping stove, feeling completely at peace. As night fell, I crawled into my tent, exhausted from the hike but deeply content. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. I fell asleep, eager to explore more of this beautiful place the next day. I'm not sure what woke me. Maybe it was some primal instinct, a sixth sense telling me something was wrong. But suddenly, I was wide awake. My heart was racing. Something wasn't right. Then I heard it. Voices. Men's voices, speaking in low, urgent tones. They were close, just on the other side of the thin fabric of my tent. I held my breath, straining to listen. The voices were speaking Hungarian, a language I didn't understand, but their tone was clear enough. They were angry, agitated. I caught a few words that sounded like English names and something that might have been American. Slowly, carefully, I peered out of my tent. In the moonlight, I could make out 3 men standing a few yards away. They were dressed in dark clothes, and even in the dim light, I could see they were armed. One of them was gesturing angrily, jabbing his finger at a map. I ducked back inside, my mind racing. Who were these men? What were they doing out here in the middle of the night? And why did they sound so angry about Americans? I knew I needed to get out of there. Fast. But how? My tent was the only thing between me and them. If I tried to pack up, they'd hear me for sure. As I weighed my options, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. The click of a gun being cocked, followed by words I did understand. Check the tent. There was no time to think. I grabbed my backpack, unzipped the back of the tent as quietly as I could, and slipped out into the darkness. I had barely taken 2 steps when I heard shouts behind me. They'd spotted me. I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face. I could hear them behind me, their heavy footsteps and angry shouts spurring me on. I had no idea where I was going. The moonlight that had seemed so beautiful earlier now cast confusing shadows, making every tree look the same. But I didn't dare stop to get my bearing. I just kept running, driven by pure adrenaline and fear. At one point, I heard a gunshot ring out, the sound echoing through the hills. I ducked instinctively, nearly losing my footing on the uneven ground. They were shooting at me. This wasn't just some misunderstanding. These men wanted me dead. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in that desperate flight. But eventually, I realized I couldn't hear them anymore. I slowed down, my lungs burning, trying to catch my breath while still listening for any sign of pursuit. Nothing. Just the sound of my own ragged breathing and the nocturnal noises of the forest. I allowed myself to stop, slumping against a tree. As the adrenaline wore off, the reality of my situation hit me. I was lost in a foreign country in the middle of the night with no idea where I was or where to go. And somewhere out there, armed men were looking for me. I needed to find help. But where? I couldn't go back to the village. For all I knew, these men could be from there. I had no phone signal, no way to call for help. I was on my own. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I made a decision. I needed to keep moving. Staying in one place was too risky. I oriented myself using the rising sun and started walking, hoping to find a road, a house, anything that might lead to safety. The day wore on and I kept walking. My feet were blistered, my body ached, and thirst clawed at my throat. But fear kept me going. Every snapping twig made me jump. Every distant sound had me ducking for cover. It was late afternoon when I finally heard something that gave me hope. The distant rumble of a vehicle. I moved towards the sound cautiously, ready to hide at the first sign of danger. I emerged from the trees to find a narrow paved road. And there, in the distance, was a car approaching. I hesitated for a moment. What if it was them? But I was out of options. I needed help. I stepped out onto the road and waved my arms frantically. The car, an old Fiat, slowed to a stop. An elderly couple peered out at me, their faces a mix of concern and wariness. In my broken Hungarian, supplemented with a lot of gesturing, I tried to explain that I was lost, that I needed help. The woman's eyes softened, and she said something to her husband. He nodded, and they motioned for me to get in. As we drove, I tried to explain more about what had happened, but the language barrier was too great. They seemed to understand I was in some kind of trouble, though, and the woman patted my hand reassuringly. They took me to the nearest police station in a small town I didn't catch the name of. There, with the help of a translator, I told my story. The police were skeptical at first. A foreign tourist claiming armed men had chased him through the forest sounded far-fetched, I'm sure. But as they investigated, things started to come together. There had been reports of smugglers operating in the area, using the remote countryside to move contraband across borders. The men I had encountered were likely part of this operation, and I had stumbled into the wrong place at the wrong time. The next few days were a blur of police statements, embassy visits, and arrangements to get home. I was shaken, exhausted, and more than ready to leave Hungary behind. As I sat in the airport, waiting for my flight home, I couldn't help but reflect on how quickly things had gone wrong. One moment, I was enjoying a peaceful night under the stars. The next thing I knew, I was sprinting for my life through an unfamiliar forest. The whole experience left an indelible mark on me. I still have a love for travel and feel the pull of adventure, but now, I approach it with much more caution and a keener sense of the hidden dangers that even the most serene places can conceal. I learned firsthand that the world can be a dangerous place, and the boundary between safety and peril is often much thinner than we realize. But I also discovered the kindness of strangers, like the elderly couple who took in a disheveled, frightened foreigner on a desolate road. As my flight ascended, I watched the Hungarian countryside shrink below me. From up high, it seemed peaceful, beautiful, but I now knew what could lie hidden within those picturesque forests and fields. I had witnessed the darkness that can sometimes hide behind perfect scenery. It was a lesson that I would carry with me forever. The thrill of stealth camping no longer holds the same appeal. These days, I stick to established campgrounds, places where other people are within shouting distance, because I've learned that sometimes the biggest danger in the wilderness isn't the wildlife or the weather, it's other people. And in those isolated places, where help is far away and societal norms seem distant, a simple misunderstanding can spiral into something deadly in the blink of an eye. I still have nightmares sometimes, running through endless dark woods, with unseen pursuers always lurking just behind me. But I also dream of that elderly couple, of the kindness I saw in the woman's eyes as she took my hand. And I try to hold on to that memory, the reminder that even in our darkest moments, there is still good in the world, still people who are willing to help a stranger in need. There's a balance, I've learned, between adventure and caution, between trusting others and protecting yourself. Finding that balance isn't easy, but it's a journey I'm still on, one careful step at a time. I live in a house on a cul-de-sac with my mom, 2 brothers, and a roommate. I'm 20, and I work 2 part-time jobs, one of which is at the same office where my mom works. She's a doctor, and I handle medical records. My brothers are 17-year-old twins, my mom is 57, and my roommate is 18. We live very close to a volunteer firehouse, and whenever there's an emergency, they blare an alarm so loud that everyone within a couple of miles can hear it. We're a middle-class family living in a modest house, but our driveway is long enough that we have a large front yard. We moved into our house 7 years ago, and for the longest time, everything was fine. That is, until we discovered our neighbor, Bob. Bob has paranoid schizophrenia and genuinely believes the government is out to get him. He thinks that people are trying to brainwash him with microwaves, and he flips out whenever a plane flies overhead because he believes it's part of the government's plan to target him. Every time the firehouse alarm goes off, Bob calls the police because he thinks someone's coming for him, and every time the police have to explain to him that it's just the alarm. He's also said some strange things about one of my brothers. For a few years, we didn't hear much from him, until one day, he sent us a letter trying to sell us his baseball cards for $1 million. Apparently, he sent the same letter to everyone on the cul-de-sac. Everyone just tossed the letters, and while we knew Bob was a little off, we didn't think much of it. Our neighbors thought he was harmless, too. We were wrong. Last winter, we started finding strange footprints in the snow across our front yard. They were human-sized, but none of us had walked that far out in that part of the yard. Our front yard is large, and we just assumed it was something odd, but didn't give it much thought at the time. For a while, Bob hadn't bothered us, and we weren't thinking much of him at the time. Flash forward to a few days ago, police were at Bob's house. Apparently, he's being evicted. We kind of breathed a sigh of relief because he was weird, but didn't think much of it. The next day after that was a normal day. Nothing odd. That was until Bob showed up at work. He began to rant to everyone about how he's in the military before going to my mom's secretary acting to have lab work done on him. This was raising a bunch of red flags because my mom never told him where she worked. Not only that, but to find my mom's secretary, you'd have to go back behind the main row of secretaries. Each doctor has their own secretary, and there are about 15 secretaries total, each with their own desk, into a smaller area where a large printer is. My mom's secretary is in that smaller area, and it should be impossible for a stranger who hasn't been there before to know where she was. How did Bob know where to find my mom's secretary and ask for my mom despite not ever being there before? My mom never telling him her name. This freaked us out and we decided to do some research on Bob. Turns out his dad was ex-military and that Bob owns a bunch of firearms. Bob's shady behavior towards my mom and showing up at our work could only mean one thing. This man is stalking us and he is dangerous. At the very least, we have begun to suspect that he has been going through our mail. It was also likely that it was his footprints that were in the snow of our yard last winter. My mom got a peace order, it's kind of a restraining order, rather quickly and then notified all the other neighbors about what happened. We thought maybe things would die down now, but nope. Today he was in the parking lot of work staring blankly at one of the secretaries. She said he was sweating and looked a little off. He didn't stop staring at her. He asked about my mom again. Everyone in the family is on edge. He has guns, has been stalking my mom at work, and is being evicted. He doesn't have much to lose if he did some dangerous stuff to us. We notify the police and are making sure to lock the doors and install security cameras so that we can see if he comes onto the property again. No one is allowed home alone until the craziness stops and until we know for a fact that we'll be safe. A few years ago, when I was 19, I was coming home after watching the fireworks on New Year's Eve. It was about 3 a.m. when I reached my neighborhood, which was usually safe, family-friendly, and nothing ever happened here. I'm from Sydney, Australia, and I live in a posh, wealthier area. My friends wanted to call a taxi since we didn't want to bother our parents at this hour to drive us home. But because I was stubborn, we ended up walking the long way back. My friend Aiden complained the entire time. Can't blame him, but Rowan was silent and just went along with it. I was in a cheerful mood. When we reached the point close to my street, we split ways. The guys had a much longer walk ahead of them, and I continued on toward mine. As I passed a small cake shop, I noticed a man across the street. I only glanced at him briefly, but something in the way he quickly looked up at me caught my attention, almost like he was interested. I hurried on, as I tend to be paranoid about things like this, and usually it's just me overthinking. I turned onto my street, but it was darker than I expected, especially at 3:15 a.m. As I passed the bowling club and the oval, I kept checking behind me to be sure. It was getting colder and creepier, but there was no one behind me, at least not that I could see. I was about halfway down my street, where the road dips, when I noticed something on the path in front of me. I couldn't tell what it was at first, but I thought it might be a dead animal. At the last second, I stepped onto the road to avoid it, and as I did, I turned just a little and saw someone behind me. They weren't too close, but not far either. My heart jumped into my throat because I hadn't noticed them before, and the fact that they had gotten so close so quickly didn't sit right with me. When I told others about it later, they said I should have been more suspicious. It's 3 a.m., and someone's walking quietly behind me without bothering to keep a safe distance? If they were really innocent, they'd make an effort to show it, right? I couldn't see who it was, or whether it was a man or woman, because they were just a dark figure to me. But it was enough to send a wave of fear through me. So, I pulled out my phone and tried calling Aiden, but of course, Vodafone didn't connect me. I tried calling Rowan next, but he wouldn't pick up either. I called at least 5 times, getting more anxious with each attempt, but I couldn't bring myself to look behind me to check if they were still there. Honestly, I'm glad I didn't. I think I would have really freaked out if I had confirmed it. By the time I reached my driveway, I thought I was almost safe, so I hurried up it. But halfway up, I quickly looked over my shoulder again and saw the figure. The way I explained this next bit is really confused and muddling because on the one hand it may have just looked like he was merely passing my driveway, but on the other, I'm much more certain that it looked like he was about to step onto it. At that precise moment, though, it occurred to me that he might be my older brother Jonathan, because no one else would bother walking up my driveway, even if this guy was following me. It never occurred to me that they would really go to all the lengths of to going up my driveway as well. I thought it would be completely safe because I had the advantage of having my house close when he started following me. However, something about the build of the figure didn't really seem like Jonathan to me, so I hurried on in anyway. My beautiful, wonderful, amazing mother had stayed up to wait for me, and I'm so grateful because she opened the door as soon as I knocked. I hate to imagine what would have happened if I had to have waited for a while. I went inside, but I left the second door open and the outside light on because I thought Jonathan might be coming in any second now. But my mom was like, "You can turn them off, he came back 2 hours ago." I did get a little creeped out by then, but I just dismissed the thought because we are all so quick to think that we are always so safe. I closed the door, shut off the light, and went to grab a drink of water. My mom went to bed, and I went to my room to grab my clothes and then went into the bathroom to take a shower. And I switched off the living room lights. This is sort of funny now to think about it. Before I took the shower, I replied back to a message from Aiden who was asking if I was home safe. I demanded to know why they hadn't picked up the phone and then told him that I was creeped out for a few minutes, but it was okay. Then I showered. I actually thought about the figure. I wasn't too convinced that it was following me, but my mind did teeter into wondering this or that. In any case, I remember thinking that it was okay because I was safe now. Then, near the end of my shower, I heard something at the window. It didn't sound like the usual creaking or bumping of an old house. The way I described it to other people was like the sound of someone resting their hands against the window to steady themselves. It sounded really unnatural, I know, because it caught my attention straight away and I immediately jumped to the possibility that there might be someone outside. And I know that only a really strange sound could make me do what I did next, which was turn off the water and crouch under the window, hiding and waiting. I waited for some time, too scared to move for a few minutes, but there was nothing. So I gingerly crawled out, still too scared to stand up properly, and I switched off the bathroom lights. But then it was impossible for me to dry myself and dress myself. So I turned on the heater light, which is much smaller and dimmer, but as I did that I noticed at the window there were very small blue lights that certainly didn't belong there. The only way I can describe it, it was almost like the keypad of a phone was lit up. I was terrified, but I turned off the heater light and backed into the corner, clutching my towel around me, and just waited. Felt like I was there forever. I couldn't bring myself to unlock the door and move, knowing it would make too much noise. While I waited in the complete darkness, I saw several blue lights flicker outside the window. It got really bright, and they were shifting, trying to shine the light through the window. Now that I think about it, maybe it was a phone? I'm not sure, but that moment pushed me over the edge. I rushed straight to my mom. I unlocked the door and stumbled into my parents' room, shaking uncontrollably and babbling that someone was outside the bathroom window. I was clearly freaked out. My mom tried to calm me down, moving quickly to find a safer room for me to change in. My dad, apparently, heard someone hurrying down the driveway, which I'm thankful for, because honestly, this whole situation still feels like it couldn't have been real. I can't even be sure it happened. Maybe it was all in my head, but everything after that was proof it wasn't. I was so rattled. I got into bed and couldn't sleep the entire night, and even when morning came, I was still terrified, especially when I heard my dad leave the house and head to the backyard. So I've learned my lesson. I'm never walking home alone at night again. Even during the day, I feel a little uneasy. We never figured out who it was. Some people think it might have been the same person I passed earlier, but I don't think it was. My brother doesn't either. He thinks it could have been someone hiding near the oval, who came out from a small opening just as I walked by the dead animal on the path, because of how quickly he appeared behind me. Please don't go walking home alone at night, girls. In the blink of an eye, you can find yourself in the wrong place, and things can go terribly wrong. My family owns several cabins in Oregon, which we sometimes use for get-togethers or personal trips. For this particular trip, I decided to go solo. I had just turned 20, and it would be my first time camping alone. Since the cabins were nearby, I figured it would be a safe spot in case something went wrong. I drove an hour to get there, and then walked 30 minutes down a trail that led to the cabin I planned to stay near. As I approached the cabin, I noticed something odd. One of the windows was missing. There was no glass on the ground, and it looked like the whole window had been taken out. It was a strange sight, and although I didn't plan on entering the cabin, I had brought the key for emergencies, so I figured I should check it out. To my surprise, The door opened without me even unlocking it. I stepped inside, and right away, it was clear the cabin had been broken into. There were muddy footprints all over the floors, and several expensive items were missing. It was disheartening to see, but there was no way to know how long it had been like this. From what I knew, it had been months since anyone had stayed at the cabins, and even then, they may not have come to this one. I did my best to lock up the place and decided to head out to find a spot to camp. I didn't have service, but I didn't feel the need to call my family just yet or contact the police. I walked 30 minutes down the hill from the cabin to find a flat spot for my tent. It started raining heavily, and being new to solo camping, it took me a couple of hours to get everything set up properly. Soaked from the rain, I sat on a nearby log under a tree and began eating some prepackaged food. Suddenly, I heard someone talking. I turned around and saw a man walking up the hill toward the cabin, drenched from the rain. He didn't seem to notice me at first. His speech was strange, though. He was talking to himself and it didn't make any sense. After a few moments, he walked out of sight, but the whole encounter sent chills down my spine. About an hour later, I decided to hike back up to the cabin to check if he was maybe staying there. But from a distance, it still looked empty, so I returned to my camp. Once night fell, I used a fire kit to start a small fire to heat up some food. The rain made it challenging, but once the fire was up, it stayed going. Not long after, I heard footsteps coming from up the hill. I stared into the darkness beyond the firelight, seeing nothing but pitch black. The footsteps kept coming until a man emerged from the shadows. I couldn't see much of him, but he seemed to resemble the man I had seen earlier. "Hey, what do you want?" I yelled, trying to scare him off. He stopped and just stared at me with a blank expression, rain dripping from his head. I yelled again, but he didn't move. We stood just 10 feet apart, and with every second, I felt my fear growing. Then, through the rain, I heard the sound of a single footstep behind me. Without thinking, I bolted, sprinting to the side of the hill and running until my legs gave out. I don't think they chased me, but with the rain and wind, it was too hard to hear anything while I was running. I made my way back up the hill and walked the rest of the way to my car, using my phone light to guide me. Once I was close enough, I called 911. In the days that followed, a team was sent out to investigate both the cabin and my campsite. My campsite was gone, with only a few pieces of useless equipment left behind. At the cabin, they discovered 3 distinct shoe prints on the floor. For weeks, I couldn't stop shaking, knowing that 3 unknown men had been hiding somewhere nearby. Nothing else was found, and the situation was likely just a robbery, as they didn't chase me, but I still wonder what might have happened if I had stayed. This is an experience my wife and I had just last year. As soon as the quarantine was lifted in our area, we packed our bags and went for a hike at our local state park. Hiking was something we used to do regularly before we got married, and I was really looking forward to it. Our plan was to hike to a specific lake, camp there overnight, and then hike back to the car. It was a clear, warm day, and the trails were dry. For most of the morning, we were the only ones on the trail. Around midday, we decided to stop for lunch at a campsite about halfway to the lake. It turned out another couple had the same idea. They were sitting at the concrete picnic table, so we asked if we could join them. Soon, the 4 of us were chatting about what we'd seen and where we were headed. It turned out they were newlyweds on their honeymoon. My wife, who's a hopeless romantic, loved hearing their story. She started telling them about how we met and some other sentimental details, but I didn't really bother to remember all of it. A couple of hours passed, and we finally said our goodbyes. We made it to the lake about an hour before dark, tired and hungry. I got a fire going, and Mandy, my wife, cooked us a small meal while I set up the tent. We spent the evening around the fire, making s'mores, and eventually called it a night around 10 p.m. I woke up just before dawn the next morning to get the fire going for breakfast. We did everything in the same roles as the night before, except this time, I took down the tent and packed it up. We made sure the fire was completely out before we left. With that, we began our hike back. By 10 a.m., we reached the halfway point but decided not to stop. 2 hours later, we ran into the husband of the couple we'd met the day before. Oddly, his wife wasn't with him. Mandy asked where she was, and he said that she had become ill the night before and had gone home. When he said this, he looked nervous and wouldn't meet either of our eyes. Before either of us could ask more questions, he quickly added that his wife had insisted he finish the trip alone. It struck us as a bit strange, but we had no reason not to believe him. Around that time, a group of people walked by, and the husband excused himself to talk to them. I didn't feel the need to ask any more questions. After all, their marriage wasn't any of my business. Mandy looked like wanted to stay, but I reminded her of the obligations we had that night. She reluctantly agreed, and we went on our way. We got to the parking lot not too long after and packed up our stuff. There were a few groups of people talking amongst themselves. As we pulled out of the lock, several more cars, including a ranger's truck, were pulling in. Once again, I thought nothing of it. We made it back home that afternoon and handled some family things. It wasn't until breakfast that we heard the news. I grabbed a cup of coffee and sat down in front of the TV. I flipped it on just in time to receive a report of a dead female camper. When they showed her face on the screen, I almost choked on my coffee. It was a picture of the woman we had met just 2 days prior. I yelled out to Mandy to join me in the living room. I wanted to be sure of what I was seeing. I didn't have my glasses on at the time, and I pointed at the TV and asked, "Isn't that one of the newlyweds we met at the park?" She watched for a moment and let out a shocked gasp. Just then, a wedding photo of the couple appeared on the screen. Mandy grabbed the remote from my hand and turned up the volume. According to the husband, the couple had been at a cliffside that was a popular lookout. Mandy and I had been there once or twice ourselves in the past. They had watched the sun rise, and as they were preparing to turn and leave, the wife lost her footing and fell several 100 feet to the ground below. It was certainly possible, but something bothered me about it. Why hadn't he mentioned this to us? More so, what was up with the illness story? It couldn't have been more than a few hours after the incident had occurred. None of his behavior made any sense. I know if something such as that happened to me, I'd have been a mess. We had passed at least 15 people that morning, and not a soul talked to us. It all seemed fishy to me. I was glad to see that Mandy agreed with me. It looked as if though her instincts had been right once again. Just don't tell her I said that. After a long discussion about our responsibilities and the like, we agreed that we should contact the law enforcement involved in the case. And as it stood, the husband isn't under any suspicion, not publicly anyways. I contacted the sheriff's office and told them what we knew. The deputy put us on hold for a moment, and when he returned, he said someone may reach out to us in the future. But it's been almost a year and no one has contacted us. And this is what brings me to emailing you here. What do you think? My instincts and my wife's tell us that a crime may have occurred. We, however, have no proof or any real justification for our feelings. And that's just what they are, feelings. Certainly, if law enforcement believed we had something to offer, they would have already contacted us, right? I don't want to be a nuisance, nor do I want to cause trouble for a grieving man who by all appearances is a decent person. But help me out here. Should I keep pushing or leave the police to do their jobs? I just can't shake this nagging feeling that a man is getting away with cold-blooded murder. The crackling of our campfire was drowned out by the unmistakable sound of a shotgun being cocked. In that instant, I realized our peaceful camping trip had turned into a fight for survival. My name's Alex, and what started as a weekend getaway with my closest friends became the most terrifying experience of our lives. Looking back, I still can't believe we made it out alive. It was supposed to be the perfect trip. Me, my best friend Tom, his girlfriend Sarah, and our mutual friend Jake had been planning this camping excursion for months. We had found a secluded spot deep in the national forest, far from the usual tourist trails. A place where we could disconnect completely and immerse ourselves in nature. We arrived late Friday afternoon, the sun already starting to dip behind the trees. The spot was even more beautiful than we had imagined. A small clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a babbling creek nearby. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and settled in for what we thought would be a relaxing evening. As night fell, we sat around the campfire, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. The stars came out, more brilliant than I'd ever seen them away from city lights. It was exactly the escape we had been hoping for. "Hey, did you guys hear that?" Sarah asked suddenly, tilting her head to one side. We all fell silent, straining our ears. "Oh," I whispered. At first, I didn't hear anything beyond the usual sounds of the forest. The crackle of our fire, the chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl. Then I heard it, a faint rustling, too deliberate to be the wind. The sound of footsteps trying to be quiet and failing. "Probably just an animal," Tom said, but even he didn't sound convinced. Jake stood up, peering into the darkness beyond our campfire's glow. "Hello?" he called out. "Is someone there?" Silence. Then more rustling, closer this time. "Guys," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with fear. "I think we should—" She never got to finish that sentence. A figure burst into the clearing, then another and another. Before we could react, we were surrounded by at least half a dozen men, all carrying weapons. Rifles, shotguns, even a crossbow. They looked like they had raided a sporting goods store. Well, drawled one of the men, clearly the leader. He was tall and lean, with a scraggly beard and cold eyes. "What do we have here? Looks like we've got ourselves some trespassers, boys." I stood up slowly, raising my hands in what I hoped was a non-threatening gesture. "Look, we don't want any trouble. If this is private property, we'll leave right away." The leader laughed, a harsh sound that sent chills down my spine. "Oh, it ain't about trespassing, city boy. It's about being in the wrong place at the wrong time." He nodded to two of his men who moved forward and started rifling through our belongings. I watched helplessly as they emptied our backpacks, pocketing anything of value. "Please," Sarah whimpered, "just take what you want and let us go." The leader's eyes narrowed as he looked at her, and I saw something in his gaze that made my blood run cold. "Oh, we'll take what we want. All right, but letting you go, now that's going to be a problem." Tom stepped in front of Sarah protectively. "What do you mean?" Instead of answering, the leader raised his shotgun and fired into the air. The blast echoed through the forest, and we all flinched. "It means," he said, lowering the gun to point at us, "that you folks know too much. Can't have you running back to civilization, telling tales about us." Realization dawned on me. These weren't just random thugs looking to rob some campers. This was something bigger, more organized. We'd stumbled into something we were never supposed to see. "On your knees," the leader barked, "hands behind your heads." We complied, exchanging terrified glances. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out of this nightmare. But with guns trained on us from every direction, any move seemed suicidal. One of the men approached the leader, speaking in a low voice. I strained to hear what they were saying. "Military-grade stuff. Worth 1 million. Pick up tomorrow night." The leader nodded, then turned back to us with a sinister grin. "Looks like you kids get to live a little longer. We've got some business to take care of, and we need some, let's call it, insurance." He pointed at Jake. You're coming with us. The rest of you are staying right here with my friends. And if you so much as think about trying anything," well, he left the threat unspoken, but the meaning was clear. Jake looked at us, panic in his eyes, as two of the men grabbed him and started dragging him away. I wanted to do something to stop them, but the gun barrel pressed against the back of my head kept me rooted to the spot. As Jake disappeared into the darkness with half of our captors, the remaining men herded us into one of the tents. They zip-tied our hands behind our backs and our ankles together, then posted guards outside. Hours passed, each minute feeling like an eternity. We whispered amongst ourselves, trying to make sense of what was happening and figure out a plan. But with Jake gone and us trussed up like Thanksgiving turkeys, our options were limited. "We have to do something," Tom muttered, frustration evident in his voice. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to kill us." "But what can we do?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "They have guns. They took Jake. We don't even know where we are." I closed my eyes trying to think. There had to be a way out of this. That's when I remembered my Swiss Army knife. I always kept it in my sock when camping, a habit born from too many times needing a tool and not having one handy, if I could just reach it. Guys, I whispered, I have an idea, but you need to create a distraction. I explained my plan quickly, aware that at any moment, one of our captors could check on us. Tom and Sarah nodded, determination replacing fear in their eyes. Sarah started screaming, thrashing around as much as her bonds would allow. Help, please, I can't breathe. We heard muffled cursing outside. Then the tent flap opened and one of the men stuck his head in. Shut up in there. Please, Tom pleaded, playing along. I think she's having a panic attack. She needs air. The man hesitated, clearly unsure of what to do. While his attention was on Tom and Sarah, I contorted myself, ignoring the pain as I managed to work the knife out of my sock and into my bound hands. Just as the man was about to call for backup, I freed myself. In one fluid motion, I launched myself at him, catching him off guard. We went down in a tangle of limbs, and I heard the sickening crunch as his head hit a rock. He went limp, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I'd killed him, but a faint groan told me he was just unconscious. I quickly freed Tom and Sarah, and we armed ourselves with rocks and sticks, pitiful weapons against guns, but better than nothing. We crept out of the tent, my heart pounding so loudly, I was sure it would give us away. The other guard was a few yards away, his back to us as he peed against a tree. It was now or never. Tom moved first, bringing a heavy branch down on the man's head. He crumpled without a sound. We need to find Jake, Sarah whispered urgently. I nodded, but I knew our priority had to be getting help. We need to get to the road, find a phone. We can't take these guys on our own. Torn between the need to save our friend and the reality of our situation, we made the hardest decision of our lives. We ran. The forest was pitch black, branches whipping at our faces as we stumbled through the underbrush. Every snapping twig sounded like a gunshot. Every shadow looked like a pursuer. But we kept going, driven by pure adrenaline and the will to survive. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, we broke through the tree line onto a dirt road. In the distance, we could see headlights approaching. Hey, we screamed, waving our arms frantically. Stop! Help! The car screeched to a halt, and an elderly couple peered out at us, clearly confused. We must have looked like complete lunatics, dirty, bleeding, wild-eyed with fear. Oh, please, I gasped. We need help. Our friends, men with guns, I stammered. Please call the police. The next few hours passed in a blur. Police cars and helicopters swarmed the area. We were questioned, checked by paramedics, wrapped in blankets, and given hot coffee. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, a police officer approached us with news. They'd found the camp, arrested several men, and rescued Jake. He was shaken but unharmed. A wave of relief hit me, so intense it almost made my knees buckle. We'd made it. We'd survived. In the days that followed, the full story emerged. The men were part of a weapons smuggling ring, using the remote forest as a transfer point. Our campsite had been right in the middle of their operation. We were hailed as heroes for helping bring down the smuggling ring. But honestly, I didn't feel like a hero. I felt lucky. Lucky to be alive. Lucky to have my friends safe. Lucky that our weekend getaway hadn't turned into our final adventure. As I sit here now, recounting this story, I can't help but reflect on how quickly life can change. One moment you're roasting marshmallows with your friends. The next, you're running for your life through a dark forest. But I also learned something about myself, about the strength we all have inside us when pushed to the brink. I learned that sometimes survival isn't about being the strongest or the smartest. Sometimes it's about being willing to take a chance when all seems lost. And yeah, maybe I'll think twice about camping in secluded areas from now on. But I won't let fear stop me from living. After all, we've got one hell of a campfire story now. I grew up in a small village near Munich in southern Germany. It was one of the safest and most peaceful places you could imagine, with a few young families escaping the high rent in the city and some older couples. Not far from my parents' house, there was a small nature conservation area, about 2 to 3 kilometers square, filled with forests and a few small lakes. While entry wasn't forbidden, there was no real path into the area, and it was often overgrown and swampy. Because of that, most people didn't venture too far inside. But I've always had a fascination with wild, untouched places like that. When I was finally old enough to play outside on my own, I started exploring the area, and it quickly became my favorite place. One day, when I was about 9, I found a small clearing deep within the forest, covered by a meadow of flowers. In late summer, it looked like a slice of paradise. Over the years, I would go there whenever I needed some alone time, whether to read, dream, draw, or later on to sunbathe and do other things. I never told anyone about it, and I never saw another soul there. The meadow was my secret, and it felt like a safe space. As I got older, I returned there for some more reading and sunbathing, and since I never saw anyone else, I would often stay topless. One day, I must have fallen asleep, and when I woke up, I was shocked to find an older man, maybe in his 50s, sitting right next to me. He was about 1.8 meters tall, dressed in white outdoor clothes, and had a camera hanging around his neck. I was startled and screamed, trying to cover myself, but all my clothes were too far away, so I just pressed myself to the ground. He simply sat there, staring at me, and said how beautiful I was and how happy he was to see me again. I asked him to turn around so I could get my clothes, but he refused, saying that I didn't need to be ashamed, and he just wanted to talk. He started asking me questions about my life, where I lived, what my name was, how school was going, what about boys, and so on. At first, I kept my answers short, hoping he would leave, but he had no intention of going anywhere. After a few minutes, he asked if I would let him take more pictures of me, saying I looked like a nymph and that he wanted to preserve me forever. I, of course, refused, but that's when his demeanor shifted. His tone became cold and threatening, and he said something I will never forget. "You know, you really are stupid for a naked little girl all alone in the forest." At that point, I was terrified. I jumped up and ran into the forest, leaving everything behind. He didn't chase me, just sat there and laughed. I spent about 2 hours hiding and waiting before I returned to gather my things. He was gone, but he had taken my t-shirt and bikini top, leaving everything else. I grabbed what was left, tried to cover myself with my skirt, and ran home as quickly as I could. I never told my parents about what happened, but after that, I never went back to that meadow again. The Swiss Alps are said to be breathtaking, but what they don't warn you about is how quickly that beauty can turn deadly when you're lost, alone, and being pursued by someone you thought was a friend. I'd always dreamed of hiking through the Swiss Alps, those towering peaks, crystal clear lakes, and the fresh mountain air. It all beckoned to me. So, when I finally had enough savings and vacation time, I didn't think twice. I packed my bags, flew to Switzerland, and set off on what I believed would be the adventure of a lifetime. The first few days were everything I'd hoped for and more. The trails were tough, but the rewards were unmatched, with each twist and turn revealing vistas more breathtaking than the last. I decided to hike solo, enjoying the solitude and the freedom to set my own pace. In the evenings, I'd meet other hikers at the mountain huts, exchanging stories and advice before heading off to bed. It was on the 4th day that I met Lucas. I was taking a break, sitting on a rock while admiring the view of a distant glacier when he approached. He was around my age, with a friendly smile and an easygoing vibe that immediately made me feel comfortable. "Quite the view, isn't it?" he said, his English accented with a hint of German. We started talking, and I learned that he was from Munich, taking some time off to explore the Alps. He seemed well acquainted with the area and even shared some tips about the best trails to take. As we chatted, I found myself warming up to Lucas. It was a nice change after several days of solo hiking. When he suggested we hike together for a while, I agreed without hesitation. We set off with Lucas leading the way. He mentioned knowing a shortcut that would lead to a breathtaking viewpoint off the main trail. I hesitated for a second, I'd always been taught to stay on marked paths, but Lucas reassured me it was safe. "I've been here many times," he said, his confidence making my doubts disappear. "Trust me, it's worth it." So I followed him, leaving the well-trodden path behind. First, everything seemed fine. The route was more challenging, picking our way over loose rocks and through dense underbrush. But Lucas navigated it with ease. As we climbed higher, the landscape became more rugged. The friendly chatter that had filled our first hours together dwindled, replaced by the sound of our labored breathing in the thin mountain air. It was then that I started to notice little things that didn't quite add up. Lucas's gear, which I had initially thought was top-notch, showed signs of wear that seemed inconsistent with his claims of being an experienced hiker. And some of the landmarks he pointed out didn't match what I remembered from my map. A seed of unease planted itself in my mind, growing with each step we took further from the main trail. But I pushed the feeling aside, telling myself I was being paranoid. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the mountains in shades of gold and pink, I realized we should have reached the viewpoint by now. When I mentioned this to Lucas, his demeanor changed. The friendly smile vanished, replaced by a tightness around his eyes. "We're almost there," he said. His tone clipped, "just a bit further." But a bit further turned into another hour of hiking and still no viewpoint. The beautiful sunset had given way to twilight, and a chill was settling into the air. That's when I decided enough was enough. "Lucas," I said, stopping in my tracks, "I think we should head back. It'll be dark soon, and we're not prepared for night hiking." He turned to face me, and the look in his eyes made my blood run cold. Gone was any pretense of friendliness. His gaze was hard, calculating. "We're not going back," he said, his voice low and menacing. In that moment, I knew I was in serious trouble. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Who was Lucas really? What did he want? What's going on? I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Why are we out here?" Lucas laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the surrounding rocks. "You tourists are all the same, so trusting, so naive. Did you really think I was just some friendly hiker?" He took a step towards me, and I instinctively backed away. "Your gear alone is worth a small fortune, and I'm betting you've got cash, credit cards, all sorts of valuable things in that backpack of yours." The reality of the situation hit me like an avalanche. I wasn't just lost in the mountains, I was being robbed, and possibly worse. "Take it," I said, shrugging off my backpack. "Take everything. Just let me go." But Lucas shook his head. "It's not that simple. You've seen my face. You could identify me." Fear, cold, and paralyzing washed over me. This wasn't just a robbery. Lucas had never intended for me to make it off this mountain. In that moment of realization, survival instinct kicked in. Without thinking, I threw my backpack at Lucas as hard as I could, caught him off guard, hitting him squarely in the chest. As he stumbled, I turned and ran. I had no idea where I was going. The trail, if you could call it that, was barely visible in the fading light, but I ran anyway, fueled by pure adrenaline. Behind me, I could hear Lucas cursing, his footsteps pounding as he gave chase. The terrain was treacherous. Loose rocks skittered under my feet, threatening to send me tumbling down the steep slope. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through undergrowth. But I didn't slow down. Couldn't. Lucas's voice echoed behind me, sometimes sounding closer, sometimes further away. The mountains played tricks with the sound, making it impossible to tell where he was. As full darkness fell, my flight became even more dangerous. I could barely see where I was putting my feet. More than once, I nearly went over the edge of a drop-off, catching myself at the last second. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in that nightmarish chase. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but still I pushed on, because I knew that to stop was to die. Eventually, I stumbled upon a small cave, little more than a hollow in the rock face. Desperate for a moment to catch my breath, I squeezed inside. The space was tight, barely big enough for me to curl up in, but it offered a moment of refuge. As I huddled there, trying to quiet my ragged breathing, I heard Lucas pass by. He was muttering to himself, his voice a mix of anger and frustration. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't discover my hiding spot. For hours, I remained in that cave, too terrified to move. Every sound, the wind whistling through the rocks, small animals scurrying about, made me flinch. I was sure that at any moment Lucas would find me. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the mountains, I finally dared to emerge from my hiding place. My body protested stiff from hours of being cramped in one position, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I had no idea where I was. Without my backpack, I had no map, no water, no food. I was utterly lost in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth, but I was alive, and that was something. I picked a direction and started walking, hoping to find my way back to a marked trail. Every shadow made me jump. Every snapping twig had me looking over my shoulder. The beautiful mountains that had so enchanted me just days ago now seemed menacing, hiding potential dangers around every boulder. It was late afternoon when I heard the most beautiful sound I've ever heard, the whir of helicopter blades. Search and rescue had been called, probably when I failed to check in at the next mountain hut as planned. As the helicopter landed in a small clearing, I broke down in tears of relief. The rescue team was shocked at my condition, dehydrated, exhausted, covered in cuts and bruises. When I told them my story, they immediately radioed for the police. In the days that followed, as I recovered in a hospital in Zurich, I learned more about Lucas. He wasn't German at all, but actually a local man with a long history of petty crimes. For months, he had been preying on solo hikers, yet had always managed to evade capture. They found my backpack, along with several others, hidden in a remote cave. But Lucas himself was nowhere to be found. He had disappeared into the mountains, as if he had never existed. A week later, I flew home. What was supposed to be a dream hiking trip had turned into a nightmare. The physical wounds healed relatively quickly, but the emotional scars lingered. For months, I jumped at every unexpected sound, saw danger in every friendly face. It's been years now, and slowly, I've rekindled my love for hiking. But I never hike alone anymore. I never stray from the marked trails. The mountains are still stunning, still awe-inspiring. But now I understand that they can also be deadly, hiding threats far worse than any natural danger. And sometimes, when the wind howls outside my window, I find myself back on that mountain, running for my life from a man I thought was a friend. In those moments, I'm reminded that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who look just like us. The first crack of the window pane made my heart leap into my throat. The second sent a cold wave of dread through me. By the third, I knew with sickening certainty that someone was trying to break in, and I was alone in a house miles away from help. I never should have agreed to house sit for my aunt. Sure, her place was beautiful, a sprawling country home tucked away in the rolling hills of Vermont, but it was also isolated. The nearest neighbor was a good mile down the winding dirt road. When she asked me to stay for a week while she went on vacation, I saw it as the perfect opportunity for a quiet getaway. Now, as I heard the sound of glass shattering downstairs, I regretted my decision with every fiber of my being. The day had started out normally enough. I woke up late, enjoying the luxury of sleeping in without an alarm. I made myself a leisurely breakfast and then settled on the porch with a book, soaking up the warmth of the summer sun. As evening approached, I came inside, cooked dinner, and curled up on the couch to watch a movie. That's when I heard it, a soft thud from outside. I paused the movie, straining to listen. For a moment, everything was silent. Then another thud, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch. My first thought was that my aunt had come home early, but as I moved toward the front door, I saw a shadow pass by the window, a figure much larger than my petite aunt. That's when the first crack of glass shattered the silence, sending me scrambling back. Now, huddled in the upstairs guest room, I could hear them moving around downstairs. The heavy thud of boots on hardwood, the sound of something crashing to the floor. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my phone, desperately trying to dial 911. But as the call tried to connect, I remembered my aunt's warning. Cell service is spotty out here. If you need to make a call, use the landline in the kitchen. The kitchen, where the intruders were now. I bit back a sob of frustration and fear. I told myself, there has to be a way out of this. I scanned the room, looking for anything I could use as a weapon. My gaze landed on a heavy brass lamp sitting on the bedside table. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I unplugged it, gripping it tightly as I crept towards the door. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from downstairs. I could hear them talking now, their voices low and gruff. Check upstairs. One of them said, make sure we're alone. My heart leaped into my throat. I looked around frantically, spotting a linen closet at the end of the hall. Without thinking, I darted towards it, slipping inside just as I heard footsteps on the stairs. Through a crack in the door, I watched as a man passed by. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed all in black. In his hand, he held a crowbar. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't check the closet. He moved from room to room, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. I could hear him rifling through drawers, opening closets. He was getting closer. Just as I thought he was about to discover my hiding place, a shout came from downstairs. Hey, I found something. The man turned and hurried back down the stairs. I let out a shaky breath, my legs trembling so badly I had to lean against the wall for support. I knew I couldn't stay in the closet forever. Sooner or later, they'd find me. I had to get out of the house. Clutching the lamp, I eased the closet door open. The hallway was empty. I crept towards the stairs, straining my ears for any sound of movement below. I could hear them in what sounded like my aunt's study. They were arguing about something, their voices rising in frustration. This was my chance. I took a deep breath and started down the stairs, wincing at every creak of the old wood. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure they must be able to hear it. I made it to the bottom of the stairs and paused, listening. They were still in the study. The front door was just a few feet away. If I could make it there, I took a step forward, then another. The door was so close, just a few more steps. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked loudly under my foot. The voices in the study stopped abruptly. What was that? One of them asked. Panic surged through me. I abandoned all attempts at stealth and ran for the door, yanking it open and bursting out into the cool night air. Behind me, I could hear shouts and the pounding of feet. I ran down the porch steps and across the lawn, heading for the woods that bordered the property. Branches whipped at my face as I plunged into the trees, but I didn't slow down. I could hear them crashing through the underbrush behind me, their angry shouts echoing in the darkness. I ran blindly with no idea where I was going, driven only by the need to get away. My lungs were burning, my legs aching, but I pushed on. The sound of pursuit seemed to be getting fainter, or was that just my imagination? Just as I thought I might have lost them, my foot caught on a root. I went down hard, the lamp flying from my hand. For a moment, I lay there, dazed and winded. Then I heard it, voices, closer now. They were coming. I struggled to my feet, looking around desperately for somewhere to hide. That's when I saw it. A large, hollow log a few feet away. Without hesitation, I dove into it, curling up as small as I could make myself. From my hiding place, I watched as flashlight beams swept across the forest floor. I could see their feet moving past, hear their angry muttering. Where'd she go? She can't have gotten far. Keep looking. I held my breath, pressing myself further into the log. Please, I thought, please don't let them find me. Minutes passed like hours. I could hear them moving around, searching. More than once, a beam of light passed over my hiding place, and I was sure I'd been discovered. But each time, they moved on. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard one of them say, "Forget it. She's long gone. Let's get out of here before someone shows up." Their footsteps receded, and soon the forest was quiet once more. But I didn't move. I was too scared, too unsure if it was really over. I don't know how long I stayed in that log. Hours, probably. The sky was starting to lighten when I finally gathered the courage to crawl out. My whole body ached, and I was covered in dirt and scratches. But I was alive. Somehow I'd survived. I made my way back to the house cautiously, half expecting the intruders to jump out at any moment. But the place was quiet. The front door stood open, and inside, I could see evidence of their search, drawers pulled out, items strewn across the floor. With shaking hands, I picked up the landline and called the police. They arrived quickly, lights flashing and sirens blaring. I gave my statement in a daze, still not quite believing what had happened. The intruders were never caught. The police said they were probably just burglars, opportunists, who'd thought the house was empty. But in my nightmares, I still see them chasing me through those dark woods, their angry shouts ringing in my ears. I didn't stay at my aunt's house after that. Couldn't. The place that had once felt peaceful now seemed tainted, unsafe. I returned to my small apartment in the city, where the constant hum of activity and the presence of other people offered me some comfort. Yet, sometimes late at night, when the city quiets down and the shadows stretch longer, I find my mind wandering back to that night, to how close I came to, well, I don't even know what. And I think about those men. Who were they really? What were they after? I'll probably never find out. But one thing is certain. I'll never house sit in a remote location again. Some peace and quiet just isn't worth the risk. They arrived with strange equipment and ancient-looking books, speaking in hushed tones about ley lines and dimensional weak points. I wanted to believe it was all some elaborate hoax, that any moment I'd wake up back in the cabin with Lily safe beside me. But the memory of those black eyes and pointed teeth was burned into my mind. This was real, as impossible as it seemed. As the sun began to set, the specialists pinpointed a location deep in the woods where they believed the entrance to the creature's realm would appear. Armed with an array of weapons both modern and mystical, our group set out. The forest seemed different now, more alive, watching our every move. Strange whispers echoed between the trees, and more than once I caught glimpses of pale figures darting just out of sight. Finally, we reached a small cave entrance, half hidden behind a curtain of vines. The air around it shimmers strangely, and I could hear faint, otherworldly music drifting out. This is it. One of the specialists said, "The gateway will open at midnight. We'll have exactly 1 hour to find the girl and get out before it closes again." I stepped forward, my heart pounding, but my resolve firm. "I'm going in. She's my daughter." The sheriff nodded, handing me a strange, glowing amulet. "Wear this. It'll protect you from their glamours. And take this." He pressed a wicked-looking iron knife into my hand. "Iron burns them. Use it if you have to." As midnight struck, the cave mouth seemed to waver and expand. Beyond it, I could see a twisted version of the forest, bathed in an eerie, phosphorescent light. Taking a deep breath, I stepped through. What followed was like something out of a nightmare. The forest on the other side was alive in the worst way possible. Trees reached out with gnarled branches, trying to snatch at us. The ground itself seemed to shift and breathe beneath our feet. And everywhere, those creatures watched us with their black eyes, always just out of reach, laughing and calling out with the voices of lost children. We fought our way through their tricks and traps, the specialists using their strange devices to guide us toward where they believed the children were kept. Every step was a battle, but the thought of Lily kept me going. Finally, we reached a large and hollow tree. Inside, suspended in glowing cocoons, were dozens of children. And there, right in the center, was Lily. "Mommy," she called out weakly as I cut her free. "I knew you'd come." Clutching her to my chest, we ran. The creatures, realizing their prey was escaping, attacked in force. It was chaos. Flashing lights, inhuman shrieks, the smell of burning flesh as iron and magic did their work. Somehow, we made it back to the cave entrance with only minutes to spare. As we burst back into our world, I heard the awful howls of the creatures fade away as the gateway closed behind us. The next few days were a whirlwind of hospital visits, police statements, and tearful reunions. Lily would recover fully, the doctor said, though the psychological scars might take longer to heal. As for me, I know I'll never look at a forest the same way again. The world is stranger and more dangerous than I ever imagined. But it's also full of brave people willing to fight the darkness, to protect the innocent. We never went back to that cabin. But sometimes, on dark nights, I think I hear faint laughter on the wind. And I hold Lily a little tighter, grateful for every moment I have with her. Because now I know the truth. There are things in this world that hunger for the brightness of children. And as a mother, it's my job to stand against the darkness, no matter what form it takes. If you've ever wondered what happens to the bullets when some idiot shoots a gun straight into the air, I can tell you one thing: they kill people. It was my junior year in high school, and I was hanging out with a group of friends at a small field on the edge of town. Since we were too young to drink, this is how we typically celebrated holidays. Our plan was to set off some fireworks at midnight, but we couldn't do it in town because of a law prohibiting them. A few of us had some leftovers from the 4th of July, bottle rockets, sparklers, Roman candles, that kind of thing. I arrived at the field around 11:30, right when the others did. Someone had brought a little fold-out table, and we sat down to sort through the fireworks. We divided them up and chatted while waiting for the clock to strike midnight. It was a perfect, unexpectedly warm night, with very little light pollution since we were on a hill overlooking the town. When the time came, we counted down to midnight and lit our Roman candles, firing them in a line. In the distance, we could hear and see other people setting off fireworks, some lasting several minutes before burning out. About 15 minutes later, some of us were running low on fireworks, and a few had already run out, sitting back at the table talking. I remember standing off to the side, where we had been shooting the fireworks, chatting with another guy, Tyler. Out of nowhere, he suddenly dropped to the ground. Tyler was known for being a bit of a joker, so I thought he was messing around and laughed, telling him to get up. I called to him again, but he didn't move. Annoyed, I started yelling at him, ready to kick him to get him up. But then I noticed something: he wasn't breathing. I rushed over to him and saw something wet on his head. I touched it, rubbing it between my fingers, and the horrifying realization hit me. I quickly grabbed my lighter, and in the dim light, I could see it was blood. Trying not to panic, I took a deep breath and called 911. I remembered one of my friends had taken a CPR course, so I shouted for her to come help. At first, my other friends thought Tyler and I were just pulling a prank like I usually did. But when I started cussing, something I rarely ever do, they knew something was seriously wrong. While I talked to the dispatcher, Katie, the girl who knew CPR, worked frantically to get Tyler breathing again. The ambulance had trouble finding us, but after about 20 minutes, they finally arrived. By the time they got there, Tyler still wasn't breathing. The paramedics worked on him during the ride to the hospital, but he never regained a pulse. They declared him dead just after 1 a.m. With his death, the questions about what happened were only just beginning to unfold. It wasn't until we got to the ER that we discovered he had been shot. This freaked me out because I knew I didn't shoot him and no one else present could have. The cops didn't appear to believe us until they spoke to the doctor and were told the wound was very likely due to a stray bullet. They still continued questioning us to make sure our stories lined up. But once they were satisfied, we weren't hiding anything. They told us how it probably occurred. In certain communities, people fire their guns into the air to celebrate, similar to the way you see cowboys do in movies. This is done most often on the July 4th or New Year's. What they don't take into account is that the bullet has to come down somewhere. They were almost positive at that point that was what happened to Tyler. I wasn't aware anything like that happened these days. Then again, I don't know much about guns. How someone could do something so reckless makes me distrust gun owners even more. Some of those fireworks we've been hearing were probably people shooting guns in the air. The officers were painfully honest in telling us that the odds of ever finding the person who fired that specific bullet were very low. Hearing this just made me sadder. As the months then years passed and no arrest was made, I had to accept that the officers were right. 15 years have passed since Tyler's death, and every holiday I hear more and more stories about people losing their lives in the same manner. Something so preventable shouldn't continue to go on. Every time I meet a gun owner, I tell them the story and remind them that every bullet they shoot hits something. Just because they don't see it or hear it hit does not mean it never lands. If you know someone who celebrates in this way, share this with them and remind them what goes up must come down. You may save a person's life doing so. This happened when I was 15, about 5 years ago, and I was living at home with just my mom. We lived in a small apartment in a medium-sized city, and my mom was always working, so I spent a lot of time home alone. Most nights, I would just hang out on Facebook. One evening, I was settling in for another dinner of mac and cheese while watching YouTube when my phone buzzed. At the time, I didn't have many friends, and the only person who ever messaged me was my mom, but she was at work, so I knew it wasn't her. I paused my YouTube video, put down my mac and cheese, and picked up the phone. I saw I had a message on Facebook, but I didn't recognize the sender. The message simply said, "Hi Amy." I didn't think much of it, and since I was in the middle of dinner, I put my phone back down. A couple of minutes later, I felt my phone vibrate again. It was from the same person. This time, the message said, "How are you doing, Amy?" I replied, "I'm fine. Who is this?" But didn't get a response. I finished my dinner, watched a few more videos, and then went to bed. The next night, my routine was pretty much the same. I was home alone, eating dinner, and watching YouTube when I got another message on Facebook. This time it said, "Are you enjoying your macaroni and cheese?" I was caught off guard, and it started to make me uneasy. I replied again, "Who is this?" Almost immediately, another message came through, "I'm watching you, and I know you're alone." At this point, I was scared, but part of me tried to convince myself it could just be one of my friends playing a joke. They knew I ate mac and cheese almost every night, so maybe it was just a coincidence. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It didn't help that it was late fall, so it got dark very early, and being home alone was already unsettling enough. My mom had always warned me to be careful online since I started using Facebook about a year earlier. She told me about how people could get catfished or how your identity could get stolen. I had not had any bad experiences online up to this point, so I figured she was just being an overprotective parent. "I'm watching you and I'll be watching you when you go to sleep tonight," was the next message I read. I turned off my phone and finished my nightly routine and went to bed, but not before I blocked that person from my account. I got up early the next day, and I could hardly keep my eyes open from not getting very much sleep. I walked to my high school, which was about a 20-minute walk from my apartment. Everything went fine at school. It was a normal, usual day at school, but I struggled to get through it because of how tired I was. But I dragged along the day the best I could. After school, I stopped at a fast food place for about a half an hour before walking the rest of the way home. While I was walking home, I thought I noticed the same car drive past about 4 or 5 times. It was already getting dark, so I wasn't sure if it was the same car. When I was just getting to the parking lot of my apartment complex, a car drove by and someone yelled out the window, "Enjoy your mac and cheese, Amy." When I turned to look, the car was turning at the corner, and all I could see were the brake lights and no description of it. I could only think of one person who would want to mess with me. I had broken up with my boyfriend a month earlier, and he lived in a town about 45 minutes away. It was a really bad breakup because I had caught him cheating, but he swore it was a mistake and he only wanted to be with me. I didn't take him back, and all of his friends told me he was not over it. I can only guess that it was him stalking me on Facebook and in the car. I ended up deleting my Facebook for almost a year, and I never noticed any more cars following me. I shook my head at Nathan and placed the head on the front of the kayak to look like the figurehead of an old wooden ship. Nathan laughed. "Let's call him Bob," he said while still grinning. I gave him a deadpan look, trying not to laugh. "You're so original." I scoffed at him before turning around to resume paddling. I stopped immediately when I saw Bob staring straight back at me. I had not placed him like that. I had placed him facing outward. I knew that I had because his face creeped me out and I did not want to look at it. Nathan was paddling while I had stopped, and so we were moving at a good pace. As I was at the front of the boat, I was meant to keep an eye out for obstacles and call out if I saw anything ahead. I was entirely focused on Bob, however, as we struck a submerged tree and came to an abrupt stop. Everything on the kayak jumped forward as a result of this. Nathan, me, our packed lunches and water bottles. Nothing too major happened. Everything on the kayak had jumped forward, that is, except for the doll's head. I had kept my eye on it the entire time, and it did not move even half an inch. It was like it was super glued to the boat. Nathan began teasing me about being blind, and I snapped at him to be quiet. He asked what was wrong, and I leaned to the right for him to see the head. I pointed and said, "It didn't move, dude," while half chuckling. Nathan moved forward to look at it closer. "What do you mean?" he asked slowly. I picked up my paddle and took a slow stroke backward in the water to lightly hit the tree again. Once again, everything on the kayak jumped forward slightly as we struck the tree, except for Bob. He stayed perfectly still. Nathan laughed. "That's weird," he said, his voice trailing off. I reached out and turned the doll's head on its spot, and it turned easily. "Let's go home," I said loudly, trying to shake off the heavy feeling that seemed to settle over us. Nathan agreed, and we turned the kayak around to head back. I kept my eyes on the head the entire time, but Bob, Nathan's name for the doll, never looked back at me during the trip home. When we got back, we packed everything we could into our backpacks and lifted the kayak out of the water. The doll's head was stuffed into my pocket. I didn't tell Nathan how creeped out I was, afraid he would tease me or, worse, use it as ammunition for a prank. Nathan was, and still is, my best friend, and he definitely would have done something like that if I'd shared my feelings. I would have probably done the same if the roles were reversed. So, I decided to keep my mouth shut about the head and hoped Nathan would just forget about it. We trudged across my neighbor's backyard with the kayak, holding it by the handles at both ends. My pocket started to feel strangely warm. I stopped listening to Nathan's ramblings and started focusing on the increasingly intense heat coming from the head inside my pocket. Each time I thought it can't get any hotter, it somehow would. It wasn't burning, but it felt like the deep heat you get from something left on for too long. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling grew more uncomfortable. It was getting dark, and I just wanted to get home. We dropped the kayak in the garage, put the machetes and hatchet away, and headed upstairs for dinner. I took a detour to my room to dump the head out of my pocket and onto my bed, leaving it there while I went to join Nathan and my family for dinner. When Nathan and I finished dinner and went back to my room to sleep later that night, I noticed the head was gone from my bottom bunk bed. My room was a mess, sure, but it should have still been on the cleared spot on my mattress. I searched around for it, tossing blankets and sheets aside, even peering between the gap between the bed and the wall. I couldn't find it anywhere. I wasn't worried, though. In fact, I felt a strange sense of relief that it was gone. However, I had a gnawing feeling that it was still around, not watching me exactly, but just a presence. Nathan seemed to have forgotten about it, though. He never brought Bob back up again that night, and he climbed up to the top bunk and promptly fell asleep. I lay down on my bed and pulled the bundle of blankets haphazardly over the top of me, falling asleep quickly as well. The next day, I was awoken by the sounds of thumping noises coming from nearby outside. I got up out of bed to glance out the window into the front paddock of our property to see my stepfather using the hatchet to hack at a tree stump that was much too large for the minuscule axe. My stepfather was a very smart man, but his grasp on common sense sometimes bordered on the absurd. I yawned, rubbing my eyes and turning around before opening them. I froze in place. There on the shelf in front of the kangaroo skull was Bob, his eyes looking once again directly into mine. I turned to look at Nathan, still sleeping on the top bunk, and instantly jumped up on the railing to punch him hard in the upper arm. He awoke with a pained cry and looked at me with a scowl. "What the heck, man?" he demanded, lifting his other arm to place his palms over the spot that I had struck with the punch. "All like you don't know mofo," I said with a slight laugh, trying to mask the trembling tone in my voice. Nathan looked incredulously back at me. I stared at him to try to see if his stoic expression would falter. It always would when he played pranks. It did not, though. I shook my head and strafed across the railing so that the bookshelf was in his view. I pointed at the top shelf. "You didn't put it there?" I asked, Nathan sat up to get a better look and shook his head. Nah, man. I would have had him facing outward anyway, I spun my head around so fast that I'm surprised my neck did not break. Sure enough, the head was now facing toward the kangaroo skull and not outward like before. I began shaking, unable to hold myself up on the railing any longer. I dropped to the floor and stormed over to the bookshelf to pick Bob up and took him out into the kitchen. I stepped on the pedal to open the chrome bin in there and threw him in the garbage a lot harder than I needed to. I did not let the lid naturally close, instead choosing to slam it down as a good measure. Nathan sleepily trudged out of my room once I had finished doing this. He stared wide-eyed at the bin. He took a moment before looking up at me and speaking. "Yep, that thing was creepy, man." I was glad that Nathan agreed with me and was not using this opportunity to make fun of me. I nodded at him. "Something about it was just wrong," I uttered quietly. Nathan playfully kicked the bin, making it rock a little. "Take that creepy doll head guy," he exclaimed while laughing. I laughed too, feeling glad that the situation was over and dealt with. I asked Nathan again if he had actually put the head on the shelf, stating that if he had, it was okay. It was a good prank, I just needed to know for my own sanity. Nathan put his hand over his heart and sternly promised that he had not done it. I believed him then, and I still do to this day, nearly 17 years later. Months went past. Nathan and I never had an opportunity to make our way back to the creek. With school holidays approaching, I was keen to get big chores out of the way on weekends so that I could enjoy the full extent of the holiday period. I did this by working on weekends with my stepfather on various projects on our rural property. We used the machetes and hatchet that Nathan and I had taken on our last trip to the creek in order to complete many of these tasks. Having no means to sharpen the tools, or even the knowledge for that matter, meant that cutting and hacking got more difficult and cumbersome as time went on. One day, as I was fighting my way through a thicket of vines hanging from a large peppercorn tree, I observed my mother lean down to pick up an object out of the dirt in the front paddock. It was in a spot directly below the main household wheelie bins that the council picked up weekly. I thought nothing of it. A few hours later, I went inside to get a drink of water and to change my shirt, as I had managed to create a large tear in the one that I was wearing. I entered my room and immediately felt strange, feeling a need to look over at my bookshelf. The feeling of déjà vu was intense. Bob was back, staring at me again from the spot on the bookshelf that I had placed him on years earlier. This time, though, a small smirk was obvious on his features. I felt nausea sweep over me, and I turned around to walk back into the kitchen. "Mom?" I asked sheepishly. My mother didn't look up from doing the dishes. "Yes, honey?" she replied. "Did you put something on my shelf?" Mom murmured in agreement with me. "Yes, I found that doll's head in the front yard earlier. I saw it in your room a long time ago and figured you must have lost it somehow." This made no sense to me. Mom could not have seen it in my room. There was no time. Furthermore, what a bizarre thing to do. To find a doll's head underneath the retaining wall that our bins sat atop of, and to think to wash it off and put it on my bookshelf. I shook my head and turned to walk back to my room, determined to get rid of him for good this time. I marched straight up to the bookshelf and reached up to grab Bob and paused. He was not there. I let out an exasperated sigh and began to violently push things aside on my bookshelf. First on the top shelf, then the second shelf, all the way down until starting to fling things around in my room. He was nowhere to be found. I stopped and placed my hands on either side of my face and took a minute to slow my breathing down. I walked briskly out of my room and grabbed the cordless phone off the wall. I called Nathan to tell him what had happened. After I finished rattling off a summary of what had happened, he was speechless about what I had told him. We both had no idea what to make of all this. My stepfather, growing impatient with how long I was taking to come back, had returned to the house as well. He was standing over me with his hands on his hips, looking very annoyed. I told Nathan I had to go and quickly hung up. My stepfather asked me where I had put the hatchet I was using earlier. I looked confused, as I had left it impaled in the impossibly large tree stump, just as I always did. He had watched me do it, so I told him as much. But he said he couldn't find it. We both went back down to the paddock together, and sure enough, just like Bob, the hatchet had seemingly disappeared. I never saw the doll's head again, but the story didn't end there. Years later, when Nathan and I were in our 20s, we decided to take the kayak out and revisit the creek for old time's sake. We took the kayak out of the garage and carried it up the road to a launch ramp, as the neighbor's property that we used to pass through had changed owners a few years back. It took us about an hour to get to the creek, much longer than the 20 minutes it used to take. When we arrived, we were shocked to find that our old jetty was still standing, having survived 2 floods and over a decade of river tides. It honestly didn't look damaged at all, almost like new. We stopped and moored the kayak to it, just like we always did, and stepped out onto the shore. My foot kicked something in the dirt, and I looked down to see the outline of a familiar shape. Couldn't be. I knelt down and grasped the handle of the object, pulling it out of the crumbling earth to reveal the hatchet that I had misplaced so many years ago. The casing bore my stepfather's monogram, embossed into the dark leather. I shook my head. This was impossible. This hatchet was the only one we had ever bought, and it was unique. Nathan and I were the only ones who ever visited this spot. No one else from my family or anyone we knew came here. It made no sense at all. Nathan looked at it quietly with me, and a heavy feeling seemed to settle around us again. We both turned to look at the wide, still water at the mouth of the creek. In the center, the bloated, rotting corpse of a cow floated lazily, drifting in a slow clockwise direction. A storm was quickly rolling in. Nathan and I looked at each other at the same time, both knowing that this would be the last time we ever came to Katai Creek. This story starts with my mom, my little brother, who was 6 at the time, and me at 19. Our washing machine broke, and my mom decided not to fix it because, as usual, we were running up the bill with how often we used it. So we started going to the laundromat to wash our clothes. This laundromat wasn't new to us. It was the same one we'd been going to for almost a decade. I come from a big family, 8 people in total, all boys except for my mom. Bless her heart. Even when our washing machine worked, we'd still go to the laundromat. And when we moved houses, we kept using the same one out of loyalty. The owner knew us well, had watched us grow up, and we had a friendly relationship with them through all the changes over the years. Not too long ago, I got some new earbuds, and I was excited to try them out on my phone. The laundromat seemed like the perfect place to listen to music quietly while washing, drying, and folding clothes without bothering anyone. The day started like any other. My mom and I separated the laundry into different washers, based on color, size, thickness, etc. My little brother, who was with us, was running around and playing with the other kids who happened to be there. We went in the middle of the day when most people were at work, so the place was mostly empty, just a few moms and, I think, one kid. Sorting through the laundry, which filled a few garbage bags, only took about 15 to 20 minutes. I remember seeing my little brother running up and down the aisles, excited after getting one of those bouncy balls from the 25-cent dispenser in the laundromat. During this, my mom and I noticed a silver car pull up in front of the laundromat. It had been sitting there for quite a while, with no one getting out to do laundry. It wasn't exactly strange, but it felt odd. I've been known to sit in my car for a while, dreading the laundry task ahead, so it didn't seem completely out of place. At that time, the clothes had been in the washers and started, so we just had to sit around and wait for the clothes to finish washing so we could them into the dryers and head home after folding. So far, so good. I decided to put in my earbuds, listening to my favorite 200-plus song playlist that I still haven't sorted. But when I listen to the music, I tend to walk around and not pay attention to anything, either inside or outside, though I stayed on the front sidewalk right in front of the doors of the laundromat when I did go outside. I headed outside with my little brother and my mom was still inside. I was pacing while slightly dancing to the music I was listening to, not really caring what others thought about me. I only stopped when I heard a car honk near my left, making me startle bad and stare at the car that scared me. It was a silver car that had been parked there earlier. Still, no one had gotten out of that car at this point. I looked over at the car, taking out one of my earbuds and trying to see who would honk their horn because it was near me. The driver's side tinted window rolled down on the car, and an older man was sitting in the seat looking directly at me. I instantly got a bad vibe from the guy because he looked like he was too happy to see me for a complete stranger. My mom at this point walked outside to our car, which was about 2 cars away from the silver one. She was getting something out, but noticed that I was being talked to by the stranger. And here's how the conversation went. The pastor, "Excuse me, young man. I'm a pastor over at X and X church. I'm looking for some new musicians for our band because our other ones left." Me hearing that he was a pastor immediately put down my guard, as I had been to church before, and that position is always a respected one. "Oh, well, I'm not a musician, but I do know of someone that you can contact." He seemed satisfied with that answer, but he motioned for me to come closer, and I took a step towards the edge of the sidewalk, still not stepping off because I still didn't want to get too close. "Can you come closer? I can't quite hear you." Me just speaking louder, I said, "I know of someone that you can contact. He's actually a pianist and a saxophone player." I actually did know one of my mom's best friend's fiancé who was super talented with music and acting. The pastor just motioned me over to him again, but this time his facial expression was less approachable but not quite menacing, almost annoyed that I hadn't walked up to him yet. By now, my mom had looked up from her car, having gotten whatever she was looking for, and walked up the sidewalk talking to me. "Hey, who is that? What do they want?" "I don't know. They said that they're a pastor and that they're looking for musicians." Immediately, Mom's expression turned serious and annoyed, saying to back away from the car and tell him to go find some place else to look for that. I looked back at the pastor, who was then glaring daggers at my mom, like legit scowling at her as if something he had planned had been ruined. I backed away from the sidewalk, glad that I hadn't stepped into the parking lot yet, and just shrugged my shoulders apologetically towards the silver car before turning around and walking back inside the laundromat. My mom followed me inside and asked me more about it later. She said she had heard the car honk and that she saw the old guy talking to me. But the moment that it looked as if though I was going to step into the parking lot, she intervened to stop me because the guy was super suspicious. I argued that I could take care of myself being 19, but she didn't care. Also, we had my little brother still inside the laundromat, so it could have been a ploy to get me distracted in order to get to him, which was even scarier. The only doors to enter were the ones that were directly in front of the laundromat, but our washers and dryers were in the far back corner. We continued to talk about it, laughing later about how weird it was that a pastor would come to a laundromat to ask for musicians for his church. Why didn't he go to people in his church to ask for references? It only got creepier when we were folding the clothes after drying them. We noticed that the silver car was gone, and the pastor never got out of his car to do laundry, despite having been parked there for over an hour. Honestly, I wasn't too worried about him being able to pull me through the car window or anything. I'm a pretty big guy, but I started to wonder if he wasn't after me, but rather my little brother, who had been running around the laundromat the whole time. The laundromat had an entire front wall of windows, so it was easy to see inside all the way to the back. I even went online to look up the church, trying to verify if the pastor was really who he said he was, and I was shocked to find that the picture of the pastor on the website didn't match the man who had approached us that day. It still gives me chills to think about it. The first time I heard the footsteps in the attic, I chalked it up to the house settling. But when I found the half-eaten sandwich on the dusty floor, I knew with chilling certainty that I wasn't alone. Someone, or something, was living above my head, and I was about to uncover a secret that would turn my quiet house-sitting gig into a waking nightmare. It was supposed to be an easy job. My parents' friends, the Millers, were going on a month-long European vacation, and they needed someone to watch over their sprawling Victorian home. As a broke college student home for the summer, I jumped at the chance. A whole month in a beautiful house with nothing to do but water the plants and collect the mail. It seemed too good to be true. The first week was uneventful. I spent my days lounging by the pool, binge-watching shows on their massive TV, and enjoying the solitude. The house was old but well-maintained, filled with antique furniture and odd knickknacks. I found myself wandering from room to room, imagining the stories behind each object. It was during one of these explorations that I first noticed the attic door. It was tucked away at the end of a second-floor hallway, almost hidden behind a large armoire. I tried the handle, but it was locked. I made a mental note to ask the Millers about it when they returned, assuming it was just a storage space. That night, I woke to a strange sound. A soft thud followed by what sounded like footsteps directly above my bedroom. I lay there, heart pounding, straining my ears. The footsteps moved across the ceiling, then stopped. Silence fell, broken only by the ticking of the antique clock in the hallway. I told myself it was just the old house creaking, or maybe a raccoon had found its way into the attic. But a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach told me it was something else. The next day, I searched the house for the key to the attic door. I told myself I was just being thorough, checking all areas of the house as a responsible house sitter should. But deep down, I knew I was looking for answers to the mysterious sounds. I found the key in Mr. Miller's desk drawer, a large, old-fashioned thing that looked like it belonged in a Gothic novel. With shaking hands, I returned to the attic door. The key slid in smoothly, and with a turn, the lock clicked open. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading up into darkness. I flicked the light switch, but nothing happened. Of course, I thought, why would it be that easy? Using my phone as a flashlight, I began to climb the stairs. Each step groaned under my weight, and I winced at the noise, irrationally afraid of alerting something. The attic was a large open space filled with the usual clutter of forgotten belongings and dust-covered furniture. Moonlight filtered through a small round window, casting long shadows across the floor. I swept my phone's light around, heart racing as I searched for any sign of an intruder. That's when I saw it. A makeshift bed tucked into a corner made from old blankets and what looked like seat cushions from a long discarded couch. Beside it was a pile of food wrappers and empty water bottles. And there, on a rickety side table, was a half-eaten sandwich. I stumbled backward, nearly falling down the stairs in my haste to get out. I slammed the attic door shut, fumbling with the key to lock it again. My mind was reeling. Someone was living in the attic. How long had they been there? Did the Millers know? I ran to my room, grabbed my phone, and dialed the Millers' emergency contact number with trembling fingers. It went straight to voicemail. Of course, they were probably on a plane or in some remote part of Europe with no reception. I paced the room debating what to do. Call the police? But what if I was overreacting? What if it was just a homeless person who had found a safe place to sleep? I didn't want to cause trouble if it wasn't necessary. I decided to wait until morning. I'd go up to the attic again in daylight, maybe leave a note explaining that I knew someone was there and asking them to leave. It wasn't the bravest plan, but it felt safer than confronting them directly. Sleep was impossible that night. Every creak, every gust of wind against the windows had me sitting bolt upright in bed. I kept imagining someone creeping down the attic stairs, making their way to my room. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted but determined. I wrote a note explaining that I was house-sitting, that I knew someone was in the attic, and asking them to please leave. I promised not to call the police if they went quietly. Armed with the note and a kitchen knife, just in case, I made my way back to the attic. The morning light made it less intimidating, but my heart was still racing as I climbed the stairs. The attic looked different in daylight. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams streaming through the small window. The makeshift bed was still there, but something felt off. It took me a moment to realize what it was. Everything was neat, too neat. The bed was made, the trash was gone, and there was no sign of the half-eaten sandwich. Had they left already, or were they just very tidy squatters? I placed the note on the bed and turned to leave. That's when I heard it. A soft shuffling sound coming from behind a large wardrobe in the corner. I froze, the knife clutched tightly in my sweating palm. "Hello?" I called out, my voice embarrassingly shaky. "I know you're there. Please, I don't want any trouble. Just come out and we can talk about this." Silence. Then slowly, the wardrobe door began to open. I raised the knife, prepared to defend myself. But what emerged from the wardrobe wasn't a person at all. It was, I don't even know how to describe it. A creature about the size of a large dog, but with too many legs. Its skin was a pale, sickly color, and where its face should have been, there was just a mass of writhing tentacles. I screamed. I couldn't help it. The creature made a high-pitched keening noise in response and scuttled towards me with alarming speed. I turned and ran, taking the attic stairs two at a time, not caring about the thunderous noise I was making. I burst out of the attic and slammed the door shut, fumbling with the key. I could hear the creature on the other side, its many legs scrabbling against the wood. The lock finally turned and I backed away, still clutching the knife. My mind was spinning. What was that thing? How long had it been up there, and most importantly, how was I going to get rid of it? I spent the rest of the day in a panic, alternating between pacing the house and sitting in terrified silence, straining to hear any sound from the attic. I tried calling the Millers again, and again got no answer. I thought about calling the police, but what would I tell them? That there was a tentacle monster in the attic? They'd think I was insane or on drugs. As night fell, the noises from the attic grew louder, thumps and scratches, and that awful keening sound. I huddled in the living room, every light in the house blazing, the TV on loud to drown out the sounds from above. Around midnight, the noises stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was almost worse than the sounds had been. I sat there, hardly daring to breathe, waiting for what would happen next. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of the attic door opening. I gripped the knife tighter, my eyes fixed on the hallway leading to the stairs. Slow, dragging footsteps made their way down the steps. A shadow appeared on the wall, grotesquely elongated and misshapen. And then it was there in the doorway of the living room. In the bright light, it looked even more horrifying than it had in the attic. Its pale skin glistened wetly, and its tentacles writhed ceaselessly. But the most terrifying thing was its eyes. Dozens of them spread across its body, all fixed on me with an unsettling intelligence. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Then, to my utter shock, it spoke, not with words, but directly into my mind. "Thank you," it said, its mental voice surprisingly gentle, "for not calling others, for giving me a chance to explain." I couldn't respond. I was too terrified, too confused. "I mean you no harm," it continued. "I am lost, far from home. I found safety here in this quiet place. But now I must go. Others will come looking soon." Before I could process what was happening, the creature turned and moved with surprising grace toward the front door. It opened the door with one of its many limbs and paused on the threshold. "Forget," it said, turning its many eyes toward me one last time. "For your own peace, forget what you've seen." And then it was gone, melting into the darkness outside. I'd like to say I did forget, that I went on with my life as if nothing had happened. But how do you forget something like that? How do you go back to normal after seeing proof that the world is so much stranger, so much more terrifying and wondrous than you ever imagined? I never told the Millers what happened, never told anyone until now. But sometimes on quiet nights, I find myself looking up at the stars, wondering, are they out there, those strange, tentacled beings? And will they ever return to the quiet attic where, for a brief time, one of them found refuge? I don't know the answers, but I do know one thing. I'll never look at an attic the same way again. I've lived in this house for most of my life now. It's small, in a quiet neighborhood, and nothing out of the ordinary ever really happens here. But lately, over the past year, I've had some really weird experiences. I'll share 3 main ones that still shake me whenever I think about them. The first one happened about 6 months ago. I usually get home from school around 4:30 p.m. because I have swim practice after school. My mom typically gets home around 6 p.m. Almost every day I follow the same routine. Get home, eat a snack, watch some TV, do homework on the couch, and that's about it. This day was no different. I got my snack, sat down on the couch, and started watching TV. After about an hour, I suddenly felt incredibly groggy and could barely keep my eyes open. I woke up about 30 minutes later to my mom shaking me and telling me to open all the windows. Apparently, when she got home, the carbon monoxide alarm was going off, so she checked the heater in the kitchen. When she walked in, she found that all the stove burners were turned on, but there was no fire, just gas leaking out everywhere. She blamed me for it, but I specifically remember not using the stove. And if I had, why would I have turned on all the burners? That incident was the first time I felt like something was really off in this house. The second encounter happened a few months later. My mom and I were building a dresser from IKEA, and we needed a screwdriver. We always keep a bag of tools in the hall closet and more in the garage. My mom sent me to get a screwdriver from the hall closet, but when I checked, there were no screwdrivers. None. Not a single flathead or star screwdriver, large or small. All the other tools were there, but no screwdrivers. I told my mom, and she thought it was weird but asked me to check in the garage. I went to the garage and once again, there were no screwdrivers. It was getting really strange. So, I went back inside and told my mom, and she said she would go get them herself. We both checked the hall closet again, nothing. We checked the garage again, nothing. We walked down the hall into the living room, and both of us gasped. Right in the middle of the carpet, there was a pile of 10 to 15 screwdrivers, all just sitting there. We looked at each other in confusion and a little bit of fear. Neither of us had put them there. The third encounter happened about a week ago, and it's honestly the scariest one. It still gives me goosebumps just talking about it. One night, I was sitting at my computer watching YouTube. It was pretty late, maybe around 2 or 3 in the morning. I've always left the hall light on with my door shut because I'm afraid of the dark, and just having that little bit of light gives me comfort. So one night, I was watching YouTube, and I kept hearing footsteps, like my mom was walking from her room to the living room. The thing is, I remembered her going to bed a couple of hours earlier, and she's a really heavy sleeper. She doesn't wake up for anything. So I called out to her, but there was no answer. I thought, well, that's weird. Then I heard the footsteps again, so I looked under my door, and I swear I saw a shadow of feet standing there. I thought it was my mom. I was like, why doesn't she open the door? So I got up and opened it, but when I did, there was nobody there. I immediately went into my mom's room, and she was dead asleep, snoring and everything. I was instantly creeped out. So, I woke her up and asked, why do you keep walking down the hall? She was totally confused and said, what? I've been asleep since 11. I kind of brushed it off as just my imagination, went back to my room, sat down at my computer, and continued watching my show for about another 20 minutes. But then I heard a click from the light switch in the hall. I looked under the door, and it was pitch black. I was like, what the heck? So I opened the door, and the light was off. I know for sure I left it on because I always do. I woke my mom up again and asked, did you turn off the light? She said, no. I was even more freaked out at that point. So I ended up sleeping with my room lights on that night. There have been a lot of other small things happening in the house too. Sometimes, doors will open on their own, or I'll hear footsteps or things moving around at night. I always feel like I'm being watched, like there's something here with me. The whole vibe of the house just feels off and really scary. I don't know what changed or how this started, but if anyone has any ideas or advice, please comment. I've tried using sage to cleanse the house of negative energy since I've heard that can work, but it doesn't seem to help. I really don't know anything about any of this, and I feel like I'm way out of my depth. I was looking for a new place to live when I found it. A studio apartment, cheap, tucked away in an old building on the quieter side of town. The landlord barely asked any questions. He handed me the key, muttering something about the last tenant leaving in a hurry. I should have asked why. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Even in the middle of the city, the apartment was eerily quiet. No traffic outside. No neighbors through the walls. Just an emptiness, pressing in from every corner. I figured it was a perk until the first night. I woke up at 2:13 a.m. to absolute silence. Not just quiet, a void. The hum of the fridge was gone. My phone, usually buzzing with notifications, was dead. The ticking clock on the wall had stopped, its hands frozen. The air was still, too still. Then I heard it. A breath, slow, shallow, not mine, came from the corner of the room. a space that should have been empty. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My body was rigid, every nerve on edge. I turned my head ever so slightly, my eyes straining in the darkness. Something shifted. Not a sound, not a shape, just movement, like the air itself was bending, pulling toward me. The silence deepened, pressing into my ears, into my skull. It was suffocating. I fumbled for my phone, for a flashlight, anything to break the emptiness. Then, as suddenly as it came, the silence shattered. The fridge hummed back to life. My phone lit up. The clock ticked forward. I lay there, heart pounding, unable to sleep. By morning, I convinced myself it was exhaustion, stress, maybe a sleep paralysis episode. But then it happened again. 2:13 a.m. The void returned. And this time, something whispered my name. A soft, drawn-out hiss, curling through the air like smoke. I didn't wait to hear it again. I grabbed my keys and ran. I spent the rest of the night in my car, parked 3 blocks away, staring at my building through the windshield. Nothing moved. No lights flickered. Just my window dark and still. The next day, I considered calling someone. An electrician, a priest, anyone who could explain what was happening. But I didn't. I was afraid of the answer. The third night, I made a mistake. I stayed. I told myself it was all in my head, that I couldn't keep running from my own apartment. So I waited, staring at the clock as it crept toward 2:13 a.m. And right on time, the silence fell. This time, I didn't just hear breathing. I felt it. The air grew dense, heavy, as if something unseen was pressing down on my chest. My skin prickled. My ears rang. I turned my head, inch by inch, toward the corner. The darkness wasn't empty. A shape loomed there, barely perceptible, shifting like smoke, its form unraveling and coiling in the dim light. A pair of eyes, hollow, depthless, stared at me. Then it moved, not with footsteps, not with any sound at all. It simply appeared, closer, couldn't scream, couldn't move. It reached toward me, its fingers stretching longer than they should, the tips brushing the edge of my blanket. Then the clock ticked forward. The lights buzzed back to life. The shape was gone. I left that night, didn't pack, didn't explain, just ran. The landlord didn't seem surprised when I returned the key, didn't ask for an explanation, just nodded like he had seen this before. I moved across town, found a new place, surrounded by noise, by people. But sometimes, at exactly 2:13 a.m., I wake up, and the world is silent, and I know somewhere it is still watching. This story takes place when I was still in high school. To fund my video game addiction, I regularly tutored an 11-year-old girl. We got along so well that her parents eventually asked me to babysit her and her younger brother a few times. One night, the parents were heading downtown to watch a baseball game, followed by drinks with friends. They told me they'd be back before midnight, so it was just a typical babysitting gig. Except it wasn't. Around 8 p.m., it started raining heavily. We lived in a Gulf city, so storms could roll in quickly, and flooding was a real threat. As the rain intensified, it became clear we were in for a big storm. The parents tried to hurry home, but the streets were already flooding, and they got trapped in a parking lot. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me at the time, but I see it now. The parents called and asked if I could stay the night, and we agreed. I would stay in their guest bedroom while they booked a motel. I got the kids to bed, and then I sat in the kitchen to do some homework and watch Netflix. Not long after, I noticed water creeping in under the back doors. Their house was huge, with 3 sets of double doors in the back, so there was a lot of square footage to cover. I grabbed every towel I could find, trying to mop up the water and block the door. Once that was mostly handled, I returned to the kitchen table to continue watching Netflix. At that point, there wasn't much else I could do. But not more than 15 minutes later, the power went out and all the lights shut off. This freaked me out a bit, but I tried to stay calm. That's when the burglar alarm went off in another room. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I was sitting in a pitch-black house with two young kids, surrounded by flooded roads where no one could drive in or out. After a moment of blind panic, I realized horrifyingly, I was the closest thing to an adult in the house. I was responsible for those kids. I grabbed the biggest, sharpest kitchen knife I could find, then went to check the doors. They were all still locked, and no one was in the house. I called the parents to confirm, and they explained that the alarm went off when the power cut out, and I just needed to enter a code upstairs to turn it off. This happened about 3 more times over the next few hours. After the power came back on, I thought things had calmed down, but then we got a tornado warning. I woke the kids, and we all huddled in a study for about an hour until the warning passed. At this point, it was 2 a.m., and I finally fell asleep in the guest bedroom. The parents woke me around 7 a.m. when they got back. I drove home, passing by giant fallen branches and abandoned, stalled cars. It all felt surreal, but thankfully everyone was safe in the end. I went camping in Big Sur, California with one of my best friends. It was off-season, a Sunday night, so the place was practically empty. We picked a campsite about half a mile from the ocean, in a huge open field surrounded by a lush forest. In the distance were limestone mountains, and you could hear the crashing of the ocean waves. We spent the night around a campfire, telling stories and eating. Both of us are experienced backpackers, so we made sure to leave no trace of food behind. I had my dog with me, too. She was leashed to one of the few trees in the field with a long metal leash and a full harness. The full moon was out, pouring beautiful blue light across the field. The scene was pristine and breathtaking. Around 1 a.m., something spooked my dog. Now, she's used to the woods, but she was flipping out, tugging hard on the leash like she was desperate to escape. She pulled so hard that her harness snapped, and she bolted across the field into the wilderness. I lost my cool. I dropped everything and ran after her, not thinking straight. My only concern was getting her back, even if it meant risking my own safety. I found her curled up in a random clearing, looking ashamed and terrified. Thank God she ran in a straight line, or I would have been completely lost. I carried her back, my heart pounding at the thought of her being lost in the wilderness forever. Once we were back at the tent, my dog wouldn't lay down. She refused. Her ears were up, and she stared intensely at the tent wall, like she could see right through it. It took a while for me to calm down from my chase, but I worked on deep breathing, trying to reassure myself that I was prepared for anything, that maybe she was just spooked from the run or perhaps exhausted from the ordeal. Then I heard it cackling. It sounded like high-pitched laughter, filled with a disgusting kind of joy, coming from outside my tent. My senses went on high alert, and my body tensed so tightly I thought I might snap. I could barely breathe. Then the laughter continued, like a group of witches cackling yards away. It sounded so wrong, loud, distorted, and full of malice. I couldn't even move to look at my friend. Felt like my entire body had shut down. The laughter was followed by blood-curdling screams. It sounded like someone was being murdered, full of panic, horror, and sadness. Could have been wolves or coyotes killing their prey, but it sounded so distinctly human. The laughter, the sobbing, the screams. It was so unsettling. Finally, my friend spoke. What the hell? I started to laugh a little, not knowing how else to react to the intensity of the situation. I can't handle this, I said, suggesting we bolt for the car, which was about a mile away, but we decided to stay. We just listened to the laughter and screaming until it faded away. When it was over, I couldn't bring myself to sleep. To start, I want to say that I love to drive long, aimless drives with no particular destination in mind. Just me, my music, and the open road. Living in Nebraska, I often take back roads or quiet highways that cut through the countryside, passing through small towns and eventually reaching bigger cities. I usually go on these drives at night, when traffic is light and I can just enjoy the solitude. I've been doing this since I got my license about 4 or 5 years ago, and I've never had any issues. That was until a few nights ago. For context, I'm a relatively small 22-year-old female, and like I mentioned, I often go on these drives completely alone. It's a way for me to clear my head when I'm feeling stressed, upset, or overwhelmed. It's also been my coping mechanism when I lived with my parents and needed to escape the toxicity of their household, especially dealing with their alcoholism. But now that I've moved out and am in a much better mental place, I don't feel the urge to just get in my car and drive anymore. However, that night I was feeling really overwhelmed and anxious, dealing with some personal issues I'd rather not get into. I was restless, irritable, and having trouble focusing, especially around my boyfriend. I decided I needed to get out and take a drive to clear my head. My boyfriend understood and told me to be careful and not be gone for too long since it was getting late. I agreed, kissed him goodbye, and left. I drove around the city for about 30 minutes, but I still felt on edge. So, I decided to drive further north on those familiar, dark, winding one-lane highways. I kept my car at a steady 65 miles per hour, taking the turns slowly, just in case a deer crossed the road. I couldn't help but admire the vast, empty darkness of the snow-covered fields and the barren trees. It was eerie being all alone with no other cars in sight, seemingly in the middle of nowhere. The few houses far behind me were dark, the dead cornfields withered and covered in snow. It felt like something out of a horror movie, and I half expected to see a ghost in my rearview mirror or someone suddenly emerge from the trees lining the horizon. The only light came from my headlights, and even then, I had to strain my eyes to see through the pitch-black night. By now, it was just after 11 p.m., and I told myself that once I reached the familiar roundabout that either led to a small town or back toward the city, I'd turn around and head home. That roundabout was still about 15 to 25 minutes away, but I wasn't too worried. I was alone, no other cars around. Right? Wrong. As I rounded another bend, I noticed a vehicle with its hazard lights flashing, about a quarter of a mile ahead. It was a sedan, dark-colored, angled so that part of it was on the shoulder but the rest was sticking out onto the road, as though they'd pulled over quickly but hadn't fully managed to park. The driver's side door was wide open. I slowed down and carefully angled my car to pass on the opposite side of the road. That's when I saw what looked like blood on the inside of the open door. I didn't see anyone on the road or in the car, and I was the only motorist in sight. In this part of the country, cell phone reception is spotty at best. Often, you can't get any service no matter how hard you try, and that was definitely the case when I checked my phone to see if I had any signal. So there I was, a lone female driving at night, stopping next to a vacant vehicle that looked like something bad had happened, with no way to call for help. Now, I'm no fool. I've watched countless episodes of Investigation Discovery, Criminal Minds, and read enough true crime books to know that this situation was screaming danger. But there was still that small part of me that worried, what if something terrible had happened to whoever was in that car and they needed help? These roads don't get a lot of traffic late at night, and temperatures were well below freezing. If someone was hurt or in trouble, there was no one and nothing else to help them but me. Still, I approached on the side of caution. I was still driving my car, though a bit more slowly, and as I approached the vehicle, I rolled down my passenger window a bit, shut off the music, and called out, "Hey, anyone there? Are you okay?" I did not hear a response. I worried they were passed out somewhere, but I wasn't about to get out and look for them. I told myself I would call out one last time, and if I didn't hear anything, I would leave. And the moment there was reception, I would call it in. And if I did hear someone, well, I would figure out my next course of action then. So again, I shout, "Hey, what happened? Are you okay?" There was silence for a beat, and then I heard rustling in the shadows of the trees, followed by a gruff voice saying, "Yeah." I was relieved at first and was about to say something in response or possibly even stop my car and get out when I noticed three things nearly simultaneously. As I inched my way past the front of the sedan, I noticed there was no damage to the hood or anywhere else on the vehicle, which I found to be strange considering the blood on the inside of the door. In my rearview mirror, I caught a glance of someone coming out from behind the sedan, and they were making their way towards my car. Fast. The person did not have any blood on them or appeared injured in any way, wearing a mask, not like a face mask for the virus or a ski mask or anything normal, but one of those masks you would see in the Purge movies, and they were holding something in their hand. I don't know what it was. I could not get a good look, but from its length and shape, my guess was maybe a tire iron or a crowbar or something. I don't need to tell you that I slammed on the gas the moment I noticed those things and drove out of there as fast as I could, my heart thundering in my chest and my entire body shaking. My window was still rolled down in my haste and the music was still shut off. So I could very clearly hear someone, definitely a man, shouting at me, though I had no clue what they were saying. I just knew I had to get out of there immediately. I stole one last look in my rear-view mirror as I drove away, mostly to see if they were getting in their sedan to follow chase or if they had stopped. The man with the weapon was still standing in the middle of the road watching me. And right before I looked away from the mirror, I saw a second man emerge from the trees that had been rustling earlier, also wearing one of those creepy masks and no trace of blood on him from what I could see. I probably broke every law for speeding that night, but I wanted to get as far away from those guys as possible. As soon as I made it to the roundabout, I turned towards the town parked in the Walmart parking lot that thankfully still had cars from who I assumed were workers closing up shop and proceeded to have a full-on meltdown. When I could pull myself together, I called one of my friends, T, who was a police officer, to tell him what happened and ask what I should do. He was concerned for me, and after asking if I was okay, where I was, did they follow me, etc., he told me since it was out of city limits, he could not do much on his end, but he could get in contact with the local police in that jurisdiction to take my statement and check it out. I agreed, thanked him, and while I waited for police to show up, I called my boyfriend. Through my hysterical sobs and panic, I managed to tell him what happened. He was, as you can imagine, super worried for my safety and wanted me to either come home immediately or drive down there himself to get me. I told him the police were on their way to take my statement, so I couldn't leave and that I was okay. But I stayed on the phone with him until I saw the familiar police cruisers pulling into the lot. I gave the police my statement and they assured me they would go back to the spot. I told them the sedan had been to take a look and that they would try to catch the guys who were there. Though with no cameras and no description of the men, I wasn't sure they would be able to. I didn't even get the license plate number. Though at the time of my panic, the thought never came to mind until the police were asking if I got it. All they had to go off of was a dark-colored sedan and two guys with masks. After I gave my statement, I went home and stayed curled up close to my boyfriend the whole night, listening to every sound the house made in fear that it would be those guys arriving any minute to finish whatever it was they started. Since the incident, I have not heard back from police about whether or not they had any leads, and I am not sure they ever will. I am just thankful I'm still here and that I did not stop my car or get out. I am not sure what would have become of me if I had. I still have so many questions that likely will never have answers. What were they doing? Why? Was that blood on the inside of the car or just a ruse to get more attention? If it really was blood, did they hurt someone? What would have happened to me if I'd stopped my car? Needless to say, I won't be going on any more late-night drives anymore, and I hope I never see those two masks again. Here's the rewritten version. To begin this story, I should first mention what I do for a living. I'm a 30-year-old female journeyman electrician. I often work alone, primarily in people's homes, which, as you can imagine, leads to some pretty interesting situations. I stand at 5 feet 2 inches and weigh 125 pounds. I'm very aware of my physical limitations in potentially dangerous situations. Having served in the military, I have basic hand-to-hand combat training, and I'm licensed and trained to carry self-defense tools. Additionally, I've worked as a paramedic in a large city, which has given me valuable experience. So, while I know I'm not invincible, I usually feel as prepared as someone of my size and gender can be for most situations. But this one triggered a visceral response I won't forget. So, let me share what happened involving a man I now refer to as the man with the mannequin legs. For the sake of simplicity and privacy, I'll call him John Doe. It was a Friday, about a year ago, around 7:30 p.m. I got a dispatch to a condo in an older, lower-income apartment complex a few towns over. The call was about a power outage in one of the units. Now, there are certain places I go into that automatically raise my awareness, and this was one of them. The moment I saw the building, I knew to proceed with caution. I immediately sent a text to my office manager, my boyfriend, and my mom, sharing my GPS location and a message saying, "This is where I am. His name is John Doe. This is his address and unit number. If you don't hear from me every 20 minutes until I tell you I've left, please call me. If I don't answer, call the police." When I rang the doorbell, a gruff voice answered, sounding like a man who smokes too many cigarettes. He demanded to know who I was. I told him I was the electrician they dispatched, and after a brief pause, he buzzed me in. As I climbed the stairs, the first thing that hit me was the smell. An overpowering mix of unwashed bodies, stale alcohol, and wet ashtrays. He opened his door and the smell intensified. He wore grubby, unkempt, ill-fitting clothing, stained with fluids bodily or food in origin. His face, thin and gaunt, unshaven with dark, heavy bags under his eyes. Entering the door, I noticed a small table that was stacked with empty beer cans toting, the king of beers. A plastic whiskey bottle went thunk off the toe of my steel toe boots and skidded across the floor. I look up at him. Though on the skinny side, he was tall. I ask him for details regarding the loss of power, and he explains that some things work while others don't. I won't bore you with the details, but in the end, I had to see the panel. He leads me to his bedroom as I pick my way across a sea of discarded items. We pass the kitchen. The sink stacked high with plates, unwashed with rotting food, precariously balanced atop one another like a perverse game of Jenga. Stepping over clothing, garbage, and discarded alcohol containers. Burn marks in the carpet from someone nodding off and dropping a lit cigarette. I enter his bedroom, a mattress with a tattered blanket, and no sheets or pillows sits in the center. The furniture is all secondhand and distressed, broken in places, water-stained as if it was saved from some unknown curb, which was not sold during the estate sale. The top half of a naked, dirty mannequin appearing, as if it were stolen from an abandoned storefront of a long-dead store, lays in the bed. I trip over something as I'm making my way around the bed. Looking down, I see two things that make me take pause. The more alarming of the two happen to be a set of legs from the mannequin, carelessly hacked from the top half with what looks to be a very dull hacksaw. Lines drawn at the natural human joints, though it was a hard-molded plastic. I also see a dimly flashing red light coming from the ankle of my creepy host. It's a Department of Corrections GPS ankle monitor. I have to turn my back on him to make the repairs, which makes my hair stand on end. He watches me, smoking a cigarette and sneaking to the living room, often to take a swig from a brown paper bag. I make a few temporary repairs and tell him I'll have to come back to finish the rest of it. I take payment and leave. He watches me walk to my truck, following me to the apartment landing and to the main front door. I am almost running now, and I jump into my work truck and lock the doors. I finally breathe. I finally feel safe until I see him in my mirror, staring back at me from the rear section of my truck. Not threatening, just staring. I leave without finishing my paperwork and go a few blocks down. I stop and start shaking as the adrenaline slowly leaves my system. I reassure my family that I am safe and tell my boss that I cannot go back to that address. He offers to send me back with another person and my heart drops. I look for a reason not to. I quickly Google John Doe and find out exactly why he was wearing an ankle monitor. He had just got out of prison. John Doe served 2 years in state prison after stalking a woman. When she threatened to report him, he broke into her home, demanded her to disrobe. When she refused, he told her he would kill her and threatened to dismember her. My heart leapt into my chest as I realized what this man may have truly been capable of. With the evidence of the mannequin staring me in the face, it appears his fantasy is alive and well. Needless to say, my company never sent any technician back to the man with the mannequin legs, and I ended up with nothing more than a story. A story that shows no matter how prepared you may be for a situation, you never know exactly who you are dealing with. It was a Friday afternoon, and I had just returned home from school. My parents weren't home yet, which wasn't unusual. They usually got off work at 5, so I was often home alone for a couple of hours after school. I was in my room, sitting on the edge of my bed, watching TV with the door left open. As I was watching, someone suddenly rushed past my room, and it terrified me. I'm an only child, and I knew immediately that whoever just walked by had no business being in my house. I quickly got up, considering my options, and thought about jumping out of the window. The idea freaked me out, but it seemed like the best choice. I opened the window, crawled out, and was relieved to find my bedroom was on the first floor. As soon as I hit the grass, I turned around, nervously glancing up at my window, fearing I might see someone standing there or coming after me. To my relief, no one was there. I ran to the gate, but the lock was old and rusted, and it made so much noise as I struggled to open it. Finally, after what seemed like forever, I got it open and ran down the sidewalk. My heart sank when I realized I had swapped into gym shorts after getting home, leaving my cell phone in my jeans pocket. There was no way I was going back inside, but I turned around and started walking back to my house anyway. When I reached it, I paused and tried to see if anyone was visible through the front window. Of course, I didn't see anyone. I approached the front door, opening it quietly, but it creaked as it slowly swung open. As soon as it stopped, hitting the closet door behind it, I heard a voice say, "Get out." I bolted away and called my dad, who was at a nearby grocery store. He came to pick me up, and I suggested we call the cops, but he wasn't scared. When we got home, he just walked right in. He checked every room and assured me no one was inside. I only went back in when he was 100% sure that the house was empty. The next morning, I woke up to find my room freezing cold. I sat up and saw that my window was wide open. It was winter, and there was no way I would have left it like that. I told my dad, but of course he didn't believe me. My mom seemed a little spooked when she saw how serious I was. Whoever had walked past my room that day was still in my house. They had been there while I slept.